Chapter 392. Lanterns were seldom lit in the cold palace, but one was lit today because it was rare to have a guest. Looking at Grand Secretary Zhang's silver hair, Jing Jiu realized that so many years had passed. I thought you could live for many more years. With your ability, the rebellion of Jing Silla is a trivial matter, and Qin and Zhao are not a threat. The world will be fine. Jing Jiu said, I didn't expect this day to come. Grand Secretary Zhang said sentimentally, I'm 80 years old this year, which is a very old man. If it weren't for the magic pills your majesty bestowed upon me every year, I would have become a skeleton a long time ago. Jing Jiu said, I need you, so you don't have to thank me. Grand Secretary Zhang said earnestly, Your Majesty dares to use and trust me. It's my greatest fortune in my life. Jing Jiu said, I also think it's a good thing. Grand Secretary Zhang looked at Jing Jiu's face, as if he was looking at the young prince who didn't like to talk many years ago. He suddenly asked, Your Majesty, have you succeeded? Though the emperor had never said it explicitly, someone as smart as the Grand Secretary could easily guess it. Jing Jiu shook his head and said, Ascension requires breaking through the existing rules. It's the most difficult thing to do in the complete world. It will take me many years to go back. Jing Jiu seldom explained his cultivation even in the real world. Only a few people, such as Zhao Liu, had heard about it. Though Jing Jiu's explanation was short, it was a sincere explanation to Grand Secretary Zhang. Grand Secretary Zhang slapped his thigh regretfully and said, It's a pity that I can't wait for that day. Maybe, Jing Jiu said. Grand Secretary Zhang looked at his face and said very seriously, There are only 4 states left in the world. The Qi kingdom is bloated and weak. Zhao's strength lies in the eunuch he, but eunuchs have no descendants. You don't have to worry too much about it. I've tried my best to manage for many years, but it's hard to change the customs of the people. The imperial court looks good on the surface, but it's actually full of holes. After my death, I'm afraid it will collapse. What are you trying to say? For the sake of the common people, Your Majesty, please come out. Jing Jiu said, Since it's a mess, there's no need to clean it up. If we can't beat them, we'll still fight. More people will die. Grand Secretary Zhang was silent for a long time before saying, Your Majesty's words are reasonable. I am still too stubborn. Jing Jiu said, Except for idiots, everyone has their own stubbornness. Grand Secretary Zhang suddenly laughed, looked at him, and asked, Your Majesty, are you a genius or an idiot? An extremely faint smile appeared in Jing Jiu's eyes as he said, I'm very smart, just a bit lazy. Thinking back on the emperor's days in the royal palace in the past 30 years, Grand Secretary Zhang was filled with many emotions, saying, I used to wonder how there could be such a lazy person like Your Majesty in the world. Only later did I realize that Your Majesty is an outsider to the world of mortals. It's just that you were born in the royal family. For Your Majesty, this is really a loss. Jing Jiu said, The royal palace is a good place for cultivation, and you are very good, so it's not a loss. Hearing the emperor's praise, Grand Secretary Zhang was so excited that he almost lost his composure. Forcing himself to calm down, he asked, Your Majesty, are you really an immortal descending to the human world? This was the biggest doubt in his life, and the answer he most wanted to know before his death. Jing Jiu thought about it and said yes. Grand Secretary Zhang was shocked speechless, saying this really, I can serve Your Majesty for the rest of my life, and I have no regrets. Jing Jiu patted his shoulder and said, All in all, you have worked hard over the years. Grand Secretary Zhang couldn't control his emotions any longer, prostrating on the ground with tears streaming down his face, not getting up for a long time. In the early autumn, the Grand Scholar died. The whole Chu kingdom mourned for him, and the whole city was covered with white mourning cloaks. Even Qin State, Zhao State, and Qi State had sent their diplomatic missions to offer their condolences. According to the statement from the Grand Scholar Mansion, the old lady requested to keep a low profile, but as the de facto ruler of the Chu kingdom for more than 20 years, it was impossible for her to fulfill her request. Even the most sorrowful and glorious was not enough to describe the scene at the time. With the help of her chief maidservant, the old lady and her 3 sons had been busy for many days, but the eldest young Master Zhang, who had been exiled to the south, didn't show up. Back then, Jingjiu had told Zhao Liu, while pointing at Liangwang Peak, that any path would have to turn back once it reached its end. It was the same for most things in the world. The Grand Scholar's funeral had many negative effects. The mausoleum was out of control, and the most troublesome part was that the commoners were forbidden from marrying for 100 days, which turned the grief in the hearts of the commoners into complaints. The atmosphere in the capital had gradually changed. One early morning, a few chancellors and princes, led by Grand Secretary Chun, came to the royal palace together, asking to see the emperor. It was unclear what they wanted to talk about. According to the information from the eunuchs in the royal palace, the emperor didn't meet these people. It wasn't until then that many officials and commoners remembered that the Chu kingdom had an emperor. When Grand Secretary Zhang was still alive, these things didn't matter. But now that the Grand Scholar was dead, it was impossible for a second influential official to appear in the imperial court. As such, the position of the emperor became more important. Grand Secretary Zhang had made a lot of preparations before his death. If everything went according to the old plan, the political legacy he had left for the Chu kingdom would still be useful for many years to come. It was a pity that there was no lack of ambition in the officialdom. The greed for power meant that the imperial court couldn't remain peaceful forever. As the third autumn rain fell, the censorate began to act. A dozen memorials were delivered to the secretariat and sent to the governor of a county. After reading those memorials, Grand Secretary Chun and a few chancellors sent them to the royal palace without saying a word. The emperor hadn't used the imperial seal for many years, and it was assumed that it would be no exception this time. However, the behavior of the chancellors in the imperial court was a declaration of their stance. That governor was someone in Grand Secretary Zhang's pocket. To put it more precisely, he was the assistant prime minister that the Grand Scholar had prepared for Jingjiu 10 years later. Once the storm started, it was hard to stop. Soon, the target of the struggle was General Pei. This famous general of the Chu kingdom returned to the capital that very night after drinking a pot of wine. He was immediately sent to prison on charges of bribery, corruption, collaboration with the enemy, and fostering traitors. The last 3 charges were relatively simple. The problem lay in the charge of bribery. The only official qualified to be bribed by the General Pei was the late Grand Scholar Zhang. The storm turned into a rainstorm. A few officials who still had a grudge against the Grand Scholar soon fell from power, and there were many rumors about Grand Secretary Zhang in the capital. The Grand Scholar was indeed too tough in his later years. There had been a lot of discussions in the officialdom and among the populace, but those discussions had been hidden in the dark and hadn't surfaced until now. In those rumors, Grand Secretary Zhang was said to be extravagant, unfeeling, disrespectful to the emperor, and merciless to the populace. Gradually, or rather quickly, the Grand Scholar had turned from a famous official to a powerful one, and soon he would become the most treacherous official in the history of the Chu kingdom. As the autumn was getting late, an official had finally submitted a memorial requesting that the Grand Secretary Zhang be convicted of 9 major crimes. The Grand Scholar Manor was besieged by the royal army. The chancellors in the imperial court didn't forget the eldest young Master Zhang who was far away in the south, so they sent the cavalrymen to bring him back. The imperial court didn't use the shackles on the eldest young Master Zhang, nor did they put him in a cage. They didn't even tie him up. Instead, they allowed him to ride a horse with them, but they intentionally leaked the news. The cabbages thrown by the angry populace and the ink splashed by the scholars flew toward him from both sides of the street like a rainstorm, drenching his head and face. Sitting on the horse, the eldest young Master Zhang bit his lips hard, his face pale. He didn't utter a single word. The cries were heard in the Grand Scholar Manor. The old mistress went to the royal prison in a horse-drawn carriage. The royal army was a bit restless, but they didn't stop her. The Grand Scholar Manor had ruled the Chu kingdom for many years. Though it had suffered a heavy blow, it still retained many secret forces. In the dark and gloomy royal prison, the old mistress looked at her eldest son, whom she hadn't seen for many years. She seemed to grow older. The eldest young Master Zhang knelt down on the other side of the iron bars and said with tears all over his face, "Mother, I'm unfilial. I couldn't see my father off for the last time, and now I have to make you worry about me." The old mistress sat down on the chair with the help of her chief maidservant. She stared into his eyes and asked, "Is the military armament case true?" The eldest young Master Zhang nodded after a moment of silence, saying, "It happened more than 10 years ago. Mother, please forgive me for my foolishness. I've asked someone to check the files. You only took the tails of silver in the military armament case, nothing else. Why are you talking about foolishness?" The old mistress said tiredly, "The amount of silver your father has embezzled in his whole life is much more than this." The eldest young Master Zhang walked forward on his knees and grabbed the iron bars, asking, "What do those bastards in the imperial court want to do?" The old mistress sneered. "What do they want to do? Of course they want to ruin your father completely and trample on him." The eldest young Master Zhang said after a moment of silence, "My side is simple, but how can they punish my father?" The old mistress said quietly, "That's why they brought the emperor out." The eldest young Master Zhang was very surprised, saying, "That idiotic emperor?" The old mistress said, "It said that your father fabricated the case of Crown Prince Jing in order to imprison his majesty in the palace. This is a great crime, punishable by the execution of 9 generations." The eldest young Master Zhang's face turned even paler, saying, "Father was indeed disrespectful to his majesty. Could it be true?" The old mistress said, "The person your father respects the most in his life is his majesty. How could he do such a disgraceful thing?" The eldest young Master Zhang didn't believe what she said at all. He said with a bitter smile, "No matter what, I can't do it. I don't want to be humiliated by these thieves." The old mistress said, "I came to see you tonight because I was worried that you would really do something stupid." The eldest young Master Zhang was slightly surprised and asked, "Is there still room to turn things around?" The old mistress said, "Before your father died, he said that we don't need to do anything. Everything will be fine." The eldest young Master Zhang didn't understand his father's last words and asked, "What does that mean?" The old mistress said, "I don't quite understand either, but I think it has something to do with the royal seal." Thinking of the rumor, the eldest young Master Zhang felt some hope and asked, "Is the royal seal really gone?" The old mistress said, "I guess the royal seal has been returned to His Majesty by your father. The officials in the court don't have the seal now. How can they punish the Zhang family?" The rain in late autumn was extremely cold. The Grand Secretary Chun, together with the Minister of Rights and other officials, stood outside the hall and waited for an hour, but the emperor still didn't summon him. Seeing it getting late, the Grand Scholar Chun took the lead in leaving after shooting a glance at the crowd. Walking through the gate of the royal palace, he asked in a barely discernible voice, "Is it really in that hall?" The Minister of Rights, Jin Sheng, was the most valued disciple of the Grand Secretary Zhang. He was only in his 40s this year. No one had expected that he would be the first official to attack the Grand Secretary Manor. The headmaster stayed in the palace for half a night. No one knows what he said to His Majesty, Jin Sheng said calmly. But since the next day, no one has seen the royal seal in the imperial cabinet. The Grand Secretary Chun narrowed his eyes and said, "It seems that His Majesty regards the seal as a life-saving treasure. What do you think?" Jin Sheng said expressionlessly, "It's autumn and the weather is dry. We should be careful of the candles." Chapter 393. I really like that name, but it's not suitable for me today. I'll find another one with the same flavor tomorrow. How to bring down an important figure like Grand Secretary Zhang, who had the right to represent history. History itself had given a clear answer many times. After he died, the emperor, who had been dissatisfied for many years, would settle the score. At the very least, he would use the name of the emperor. Therefore, the charges that Grand Secretary Chun, Jin Sheng, and others had prepared for Grand Secretary Zhang were all related to disrespect. However, this kind of operation required the approval of the emperor, so they naturally had to show enough respect to the emperor and give up enough benefits, unless they wanted to rebel. Unfortunately, they didn't have the power or the ambition. At most, they could only hope that they could control the emperor to control the Chu kingdom. Therefore, when Jingjiao didn't want to see them, they couldn't do anything. They also couldn't force their way into the palace to find the imperial seal. What was the difference between that and the charges they had prepared for Grand Secretary Zhang? Fortunately, the imperial palace was under strict control of the imperial court. There was no such thing as an internal court. Those eunuchs and palace maids hadn't even seen the emperor many times, so it was easy to arrange some accidents. It was a hot autumn night. It was a good time to set fire. Prime President Jin didn't leave the cabinet. He stared in the direction of the imperial palace across the square, waiting for the fire to appear. However, when morning came, his eyes were so dry that they hurt. The imperial palace was still quiet. Nothing happened. There was still no news until evening. There wasn't even any sign that they had failed. The eunuchs who had set the fire had disappeared. The city gate department didn't find them. The guards and the imperial army didn't find them either. It was as if they had disappeared into thin air. Prime President Jin felt that things were a bit strange. He felt a faint chill in his heart. He used several hot towels to warm his face to dispel his sleepiness and chill. Then, he went to Grand Secretary Chen's manor. He didn't know what Grand Secretary Chen said to him. From the movements in the imperial palace, they didn't seem to have given up the idea of setting the palace on fire. However, from that night onwards, the autumn rain in the capital city became endless and did not stop for even a moment. Perhaps because of the autumn rain, the palace never caught fire. The pitter-patter of raindrops falling from the gloomy clouds brought with them a chill that invaded the clothes and blankets. It was very annoying. The officials in the imperial court were naturally the most annoyed. One day, Grand Secretary Chen called Prime President Jin in private and said, "The opportunity is now. Don't miss it." Jin Qing understood what he meant. Everything in the world, including fame, status, power, wealth, and even cultivation, would fall when it reached its peak. It was the same with public opinion. It was the moment when the populace of the Chu kingdom resented Grand Secretary Zhang the most. If the imperial court didn't seize the opportunity, those scholars and populace might start to miss the Grand Secretary, whom they had trampled into the mud after this period of time, and it would be more troublesome for them to deal with the matter at that time. That night, someone sent a message to the eldest young Master Zhang in the imperial prison, saying that if he confessed to the case of the ordinance, the matter would end there. Otherwise, sitting in the haystack, the eldest young Master Zhang thought of the cabbages and ink thrown at him from both sides of the street on the day when he was escorted back to the capital by the cavalrymen, and a despairing expression appeared in his eyes. Did his father really say that before his death? Nothing would go wrong if he didn't do anything. Even if his father did say that, it was impossible. It was not the first time that he had misjudged the situation. The eldest young Master Zhang remembered the conversation he had with his father many years ago. At the time, he knelt before the sickbed and begged his father to consider his future affairs with tears all over his face. Was he going to watch his sons die or be exiled? His father refused his request severely, telling him not to mention it again and that nothing would happen to them. Later, his father even exiled him to the south. But what about now? He was about to die in the imperial prison, and the Grand Secretary's manor was besieged and was about to be raided. The chancellors in the imperial court used to be your good friends and students, but now they want to dig you out from your grave and whip your corpse. It has been like this in history. Why can't you understand it? Looking at the white silk and the bottle of poison left on the ground by the intruder, the corners of the eldest young Master Zhang's mouth twitched slightly, and a neurotic smile appeared on his face. He suddenly yelled miserably, "Jin Cheng, you would die a horrible death." It was quiet in the prison, and nobody came to stop him. Only his miserably cursing echoed in the cell. The white silk was tied to the top of the iron bars, fluttering gently, like the white banners in the graveyard. It broke with a cracking sound. The eldest young Master Zhang fell on the haystack, feeling bewildered. He found the bottle of poison, opened it with trembling hands, and poured it into his mouth. A moment later, he found that the bottle, which was supposed to contain poison, was filled with clear water. He came back to his senses and looked at the dark and gloomy outside the cell warily. "Who is it?" he asked in a low voice. A man in black walked out from the shadow and said, "It's so troublesome. I hope you won't try to hit your head against the wall again." The eldest young Master Zhang was surprised. The imperial prison of the Chu kingdom was heavily guarded, and the formations were hidden behind the stone walls. Even the most formidable swordsmen and cultivation practitioners couldn't sneak in. "Who are you? Why did you save me? I'm just a worker. Do you think I want to meddle in other people's business?" The man in black had a broken hand, and his sleeve drooped down weakly, just like his voice. "I have many important things to do. I was about to go to Zhao State to kill that eunuch and the White Emperor, but I was summoned here by someone." Having heard this, the eldest young Master Zhang's pupils contracted, and he asked in a trembling voice, "Are you a man in black?" The man looked at his clothes and asked in confusion, "Is there something wrong with your eyes?" The eldest young Master Zhang murmured, "You're not dead yet." The man in black he mentioned was not a man in black, but a specific name for a certain person in this world. Many years ago, a powerful swordsman who liked to fight and kill appeared in this world. It was said that he was second only to Duke Missouri. His fighting capacity was extremely formidable, and he killed countless swordsmen in the four kingdoms of Qin, Zhao, Qi, and Chu. When the swordsman appeared, he was dressed in black, so he was called the Man in Black. It was said that the Man in Black left the Central Plains and went to the West regions to cultivate and break the state. Who would have thought that he would come back again? The eldest young Master Zhang stared into his eyes and said, "You haven't answered my question. Why did you save me?" The man in black didn't pay any attention to him. He broke open the iron bars, knocked him unconscious, and carried him out. The blue bird had asked him to protect the lives of the people in the imperial prison. The general and the rest of the officials were strong-willed and didn't want to commit suicide. This eldest young Master Zhang was indeed troublesome, so it was the simplest way to deal with him. The man in black was Zhuo Ruzhui, who handled the matter so casually and lazily. However, no matter how powerful an assassin was, he couldn't fight against the imperial court head-on. Zhuo Ruzhui left the imperial prison with the unconscious eldest young Master Zhang and disappeared from the capital of the Chu kingdom. Like a drop of water falling into the ocean, it didn't cause any ripples. The autumn wind and rain were as worrisome as usual. The news that the eldest young Master Zhang had escaped from the prison didn't worry the officials of the imperial court too much. On the contrary, they felt relieved. In this way, they could finally take another step forward. They could seize this opportunity to confiscate the Grand Scholar Manor. They believed that even if they couldn't find the royal seal and the emperor didn't show up, the Zhang family would be sentenced to death. With this thought in mind, the Minister of Rights, Jin Sheng, came to the outside of the Grand Scholar Manor. The front gate of the Grand Scholar Manor had been smashed open, and hundreds of soldiers had entered the manor and occupied all the important places. They had already started to search the manor. It was a chaotic scene, with overturned cabinets, collapsed flower racks, and cries everywhere. Even the rockery in the back garden had been dug up, revealing a secret room full of golden bricks. Jin Sheng furrowed his brows slightly, feeling displeased. He instructed his subordinates by his side, "Behave yourself. Don't startle the madam." The subordinates responded in unison, but they were complaining in their minds, thinking that the Prime Minister was the most valued student of the Grand Scholar Manor back in the day. Were you going to keep on pretending? The sound of cursing suddenly came from the deep end of the Grand Scholar Manor, as well as the sound of a heavy object falling to the ground. Prime President Jin's brows furrowed even more as he walked in that direction. The subordinate explained in a low voice, "The back house has been controlled, but it's a bit inconvenient for the madam to live in the back garden." Prime President Jin didn't halt his steps and asked in a low voice, "Have you put the object away?" The subordinate replied in an even lower voice, "It's at the bottom of the suitcase. There's nothing wrong with it." Prime President Jin uttered, and didn't say anything more. Soon, he arrived at the outside of the back garden. The back garden was even more messy. A few female servants had been pushed to the ground, their foreheads bleeding, and cloth and clothes were scattered everywhere. Seeing the scene in front of him, Prime President Jean showed a hint of sympathy in his eyes. He had been to the Grand Scholar Manor many times, and he often came to the back garden. Not long ago, he had fed his teacher the medicine in this place several times. Seeing his expression, a few subordinates persuaded him to do something appropriate, such as the affairs of the state are more important, and the master. The expression on Prime President Jin's face eased up a bit. Looking at the chaotic scene around him, he let out a self-mocking smile. It was a royal robe. In the past 20 years, he had been trying to persuade his teacher to ascend the throne and become the emperor, but his teacher had always disagreed. Now that his teacher was dead, Prime President Jean decided to prepare a royal robe for him as a show of filial piety. There was a large pearwood chest in the Granny Dowager's room, and the royal robe was at the bottom of the chest. Looking at the tightly closed door, Prime President Jean tidied up his clothes and said calmly, "Master's wife, please open the door." There was a faint sound in the room, but nobody opened the door. As time passed slowly, Prime President Jin's expression grew cold, and he said sternly, "Break the door open." Ignoring the cries and curses of the female servants, a dozen soldiers climbed up the stairs and broke the door open easily, entering the room in a single file. However, these soldiers quickly retreated from the room with a strange expression on their faces, as if they had seen a ghost. A person walked out of the room. His hair was disheveled, and his face couldn't be seen clearly, but the bright yellow royal robe he was wearing was very eye-catching. Seeing the royal robe, the official in charge of this matter changed his expression abruptly, wondering how someone had found the clothes hidden at the bottom of the chest and put them on. No matter who it was, wearing the royal robe was a capital offense, and it came from the Granny Dowager's room. How could the Grand Scholar Manor get away with it? How dare he wear the royal robe? Arrest this treacherous thief for me. The official ordered sternly, but he didn't notice the commotion around him. Looking at the man wearing the royal robe, Prime President Jin's face turned pale. The man raised his hands and parted his black hair, revealing his handsome face. "I'm the emperor. What should I wear if not the royal robe?" he asked nonchalantly. Chapter 394. Few people in the Chu kingdom had seen the emperor, who had lived in seclusion in the palace for decades. For example, the officials and soldiers who raided the Grand Secretary's mansion today had never seen the emperor. Seeing the man walking out of Madame Dowager's room, they were all stunned, wondering if he was a lunatic. Minister Jin Sheng was very experienced. He had entered the court when he was young and had the honor of meeting His Majesty at the coronation ceremony 20 years ago. At that time, His Majesty was only a 10-year-old boy. Now, he should be 30 years old, considered middle-aged. But why was his face still so beautiful after parting his black hair? His Majesty's sudden appearance in the scholar's mansion, his plot being foiled, and his appearance being the same as before, these three matters were like three bolts of lightning that directly struck Minister Jin's heart. He subconsciously knelt down and stammered, "Long live," only then did the officials and soldiers react. They were shocked speechless and knelt down unevenly. The old mistress walked out of the room with the help of her crutches, just in time to see the whole mansion kneeling down like a tide. Jing Jiao turned to her and said, "I promised him that as long as I am the emperor, I will guarantee you a lifetime of riches and honor." Hearing this, the madam was even more agitated. She knelt down shakily and said, "Thank you for your pity, Your Majesty." It was deathly quiet in the Grand Scholar Manor, and then a burst of crying broke out. The cries came from the descendants of Grand Secretary Zhang, as well as the housekeepers and servants. When the imperial court confiscated the houses of the Grand Scholar Manor that day, there had been many cries in the Grand Scholar Manor. However, those cries were of grievance and fear at the time, and now they were cries of joy and happiness after escaping from a catastrophe. Among the crimes that the imperial court had assigned to the Grand Scholar, the one that couldn't be cleared of was the crime of imprisoning the emperor, which was treason. Today, The emperor came to the Grand Scholar Manor in person, and his words had been confirmed. Who dared object? Prime President Jean knelt on the ground. When he heard this, his expression changed, and he finally came to his senses. If the situation continued to develop like this, all the preparations he and the officials in the court would be for naught. How could he allow such a thing to happen? Even if the emperor was not an idiot, he probably did not know a single official after being imprisoned in the palace for 20 years. What power did he have? So what if he died? The power brought by ambition and greed supported Prime President Jean to stand up. He stared into Jing Jio's eyes and prepared to shout out the most crucial words. This person is fake. How dare you impersonate His Majesty the Emperor? This is a great crime, punishable by death by 1,000 cuts. It's not too much to kill you with a flurry of blades, right? In order to conceal the royal robe worn by the Grand Scholar Manor in private, the Grand Scholar Manor had dared to let someone pretend to be the emperor. It was not an exaggeration to say that the whole family of the Grand Scholar Manor would be executed. In a very short period of time, Prime President Jean thought of many things. Many scenes flashed before his eyes, and all of them were blood. In the next moment, he realized that he didn't make a sound. Hundreds of officials and soldiers knelt on the ground, looking at him with a strange expression. Prime President Jin's mouth was agape, and his face was filled with horror. The only sound he could hear was his own heartbeat. Dong, 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 dong. His heart beat faster and faster, like a rapid drum beat, as if it was about to jump out of his throat. It was even faster. An indescribable pain burst out from his chest and spread to all parts of his body. If he could make a sound, he would have screamed like a wounded beast. But he couldn't, so he could only look at Jing Jio in horror. Looking at those eyes that were as deep as the ocean, Prime President Jean suddenly understood many things. Why his teacher didn't dare to usurp the throne, why the emperor shut himself in the palace, why the crown Prince Jing came to the capital and died, why the fire in the palace didn't light up when the autumn rain didn't fall unfortunately. He understood it too late. The strong remorse, despair, and fear made him cough painfully. Blood spurted out from his lips like a mist. There were screams in the hall. He continued to cough, his body bent like a cooked shrimp, blood spurting out incessantly. In the end, he even coughed up some pieces of flesh and blood. Jing Jio took the hairband from the dowager's hand and tied up his black hair. He walked past Prime President Jean and headed for the outside of the Grand Secretary's mansion, not even looking at this person. The dowager saw him off with a humble expression, leaning on her walking stick. When she passed by Prime President Jean, she spat on his face. That mouthful of saliva was like a hammer, and Minister Jean directly fell to the ground. He twitched a few times and then stopped breathing. That night, all the officials in the capital of the Chu Kingdom who were qualified to attend the court meeting received a notice that there would be a court meeting the next day. In fact, the royal palace only sent a eunuch to inform Grand Secretary Chun. It could be imagined that the emperor, who hadn't been out of the palace for 20 years, didn't have anyone he could use. This fact didn't make the officials who received the notice feel at ease, because what had happened in the Grand Secretary's mansion had spread throughout the capital. Before dawn, carriages appeared one after another on the road, leading to the royal palace. Some officials were still talking to the caretakers of their mansions by the windows. They weren't talking about their last words, but preparing for the great change that might happen that day. Few chancellors were willing to wait for death, even when faced with the imperial power, not to mention that the imperial power was nothing in the history of the Chu Kingdom in the last few decades. The door of the hall opened slowly. The officials looked at each other, stopped talking, and walked in slowly, lining up in 2 rows according to the usual practice. No one liked to attend court meetings, but it was necessary to govern a country. The court meetings had never stopped, but it had been many years since the emperor came to the court in person. Some chancellors remembered that the last time the emperor came to the court meeting was during the enthronement ceremony. Some officials with good memories remembered that when Grand Secretary Zhang was impeached, the emperor came to the court and said, "The Grand Secretary has done a good job, so don't make trouble." Are we still making trouble in the eyes of the emperor after the death of the Grand Secretary? What trouble does the emperor want to make? Looking at the yellow-robed man sitting high on the throne, many officials had all sorts of thoughts in their minds. Then, their gazes were quickly drawn to that extremely handsome face. They were very shocked, thinking that His Majesty was actually such a handsome man. His black hair was only casually tied behind his head. So how could he have the grace of an immortal? Jingjio didn't care what these chancellors were thinking, saying, "Let's begin." A young eunuch glanced at the list in his hand nervously and was about to speak. It was then that Grand Secretary Chen suddenly stepped forward and bowed to Jingjio, saying, "Your Majesty, I have something to ask you." Jingjio glanced at this person, but didn't say anything. Grand Secretary Chen said, "Yesterday, the Minister of Rights, Jin Sheng, was ordered to inspect the Zhang Manor. Why were you there, Your Majesty? And why did Prime President Jin suddenly die?" These two questions were extremely rude, and what was more rude was that he had been staring into Jingjio's eyes while he was asking the questions, showing no respect to the emperor. Grand Secretary Chen stared into Jingjio's eyes, trying to figure out something from them. Yesterday, the emperor suddenly appeared in the Zhang Manor, and Jin Sheng suddenly died. He was so shocked that he finally remembered a secret rumor. The Grand Secretary Zhang didn't want to do anything to the emperor because he knew that the emperor had been making magic pills and cultivating. In today's court meeting, Grand Secretary Chen wanted to know if this rumor was true or not. Of course, he had already prepared for it. Even if the emperor was a cultivation practitioner with a high cultivation state, he still couldn't change the general trend of the entire Chu kingdom. Jingjio didn't want to answer this question. The young eunuch was very smart. He suppressed his nervousness and rebuked. Following the imperial decree, His Majesty didn't give the decree. Whose decree are you following? The young eunuch's voice was very shrill. Because of his nervousness, it was somewhat hoarse. It sounded like a little rooster being squeezed by the neck. It was very unpleasant. Such an unpleasant voice echoed in the empty Great Hall. Grand Secretary Chen was slightly startled and didn't know how to answer. Jingjio didn't want this boring process to continue. Looking at the officials in the Great Hall, he said, "Grand Secretary Zhang was chosen by me. If you touch him, you'll be touching me." These words were very rude and meaningless. They didn't match the temperament of officialdom and sounded more like the tone of a Jianghu man. Hearing these words, the officials didn't feel afraid. On the contrary, they felt it was funny. Some of them even laughed out loud. Jingjio didn't pay any attention to them. He continued, "That will cause the death of the entire family." These words were very indifferent, without any killing intent. They weren't like thunder, but like a gust of wind. However, they made everyone in the Great Hall feel an extreme chill. The young eunuch took 2 steps forward with a list in his arms. He nervously swallowed and began to read out the names. The officials whose names he had called stepped forward with a bewildered expression. There were only 7 or 8 of them. The officials whose names weren't called were also puzzled, wondering what was going on. The young eunuch thought about what he was going to say next. His expression became even more nervous, and his voice became hoarser. He wasn't a great person. It was just that a few nights ago, when he woke up, he found a few dark figures sneaking into the Great Hall to set fire. He summoned up his courage and shouted. After shouting, he thought he would die. Unexpectedly, the fire didn't start and he didn't die. Instead, he became the emperor's trusted aide. Of course, it could also be because the emperor only knew him, the young eunuch. Thinking of these things, the young eunuch's nervousness was relieved. He cleared his throat and said to the officials in the Great Hall, "The officials whose names were called are innocent. The rest are unforgivable." Before he could finish his sentence, he was interrupted. There was an uproar in the Great Hall. The officials looked at Jingjio on the throne, their gazes filled with shock. Was the world really going to change? "Your Majesty, you don't have anything. You don't have any officials, troops, guards, or even eunuchs. You only have this immature child, yet you want to wipe out the entire Chu country's bureaucracy? Where did this crazy idea come from? Was His Majesty really as the rumors said? If he wasn't an idiot, then he was a madman. Does His Majesty want to use the imperial seal to decide the world?" Grand Secretary Chen laughed. Looking at Jing Jiao on the throne, his face full of pity, he said, "The capital, the provinces, the officials, the soldiers, the scholars, and the common people are all clear-headed people who would listen to you, even if you could persuade some of the guards, or even yourself." He paused here and didn't finish his conjecture. The mockery on his face was very strong. A general sneered. "Even if you could keep us in the imperial palace for a while, what use would it be?" Yes, even if Jing Jiao could find a way to seal the imperial palace, he would have no way of keeping these officials in the imperial palace for a long time and forcing them to acknowledge his authority. These officials had made preparations before entering the imperial palace. As long as they stayed for a long time, the stewards and family generals of the various manors would be dispatched, and the camps outside the capital would be brought in. It would be very simple for the imperial army to choose between an idiotic emperor who had been imprisoned for many years and the entire imperial court. How long could the imperial palace hold out? Once the imperial palace was breached, what would your majesty do? Grand Secretary Chun looked into Jing Jiao's eyes in silence, waiting for his answer. Jing Jiao said, "I've never thought of keeping you here." With these words, the door of the great hall suddenly closed. A shadow fell on everyone's bodies and hearts. The young eunuch had been warned in advance. Holding the name list in his bosom, he led the officials whose names had been called to hide in a corner behind the throne. It was very gloomy inside the great hall, but it was sunny outside. Zhe Rujui leaned against the door of the great hall, squinting at the rising sun, exuding a sense of laziness all over his body. The eldest young Master Zhang stood beside him and asked with a pale face, "Is that all? What else?" Zhe Rujui said with drooping eyelids, "The name list was written by you yourself. If there's a mistake, it's your fault." The eldest son of the grand scholar Zhang said anxiously, "Am I talking about the name list? I said His Majesty is in the great hall." A scream suddenly rang out in the great hall, followed by the incessant sound of a sharp object cutting through flesh. The eldest young Master Zhang could not see the scene in the great hall, so he could only guess. He was so nervous that he began to retch, but since he had not eaten anything, he could not vomit. Just then, a muffled sound came from the door of the great hall, followed by a faint cry for help. It should be the ministers banging on the door, trying to run out. The eldest young Master Zhang had no time to care about the annoyance in his heart, and hurriedly used his shoulder to block the door. His face was full of fear, and his sweat was pouring down like rain. Looking at his embarrassed appearance, Zhe Rujui was very satisfied, and said, "Not bad. This is the time to show off. You should know that you used to be an assassin. Your father was afraid that you would be killed by the emperor, so he banished you to the south to avoid trouble. Your emperor is very stingy. If you don't do something now, he might kill you when he remembers what happened in the past." At such a tense moment, the eldest young Master Zhang did not listen to what he said, and only tried his best to block the door of the great hall. A stream of blood splashed on the door of the great hall, and he was so scared that he shivered. He shouted crazily, "Why don't you go in and help?" In his opinion, since the man in black was the most powerful assassin in the world, even if he could not help His Majesty kill these rebels, he could at least save His Majesty. Rui said inexplicably, "Why do we need to worry about him?" The eldest young Master Zhang misunderstood him, and his eyes became excited, and he said, "How many bodyguards are there in the great hall? Or did you invite many highly skilled cultivators to come here?" "Only him." Zhe Rujui did not care that this sentence made the face of the eldest young Master Zhang even paler. He waved his hand to signal the eunuchs not far away to come over, and said, "You go and prepare some clean water first. Remember, a lot of clean water. Otherwise, when the blood coagulates, it will be very troublesome to clean it up." In fact, neither he nor the eldest young Master Zhang understood why these middle-aged eunuchs were so bold and dared to stay here at such a time. The eunuchs smiled apologetically and said, "Don't worry, masters. We have done this a few times." Not long after, the sound in the great hall disappeared, and the silence was frightening. The eldest young Master Zhang looked inside with some fear, but he could not see anything. His shoulders slowly moved away from the door of the Great Hall. The door of the Great Hall slowly opened, and Jing Jiao walked out. His hair was disheveled, and his body was covered in blood. He held a sword in his right hand, and his face was a little pale. The eldest young master Zhang hurriedly knelt down and did not dare to raise his head to look. Jing Jiao looked into the distance and said, "Tell your mother that this hair rope is not strong enough." Chapter 395. This chapter was supposed to be the last chapter where the lights in the room dimmed, unable to shine through my body. Fortunately, I am very satisfied with the title. In the Great Hall, Grand Secretary Chun and a general had said in a mocking tone that even if Jing Jiao could trap these officials in the palace, it would be useless. Jing Jiao had never thought of doing this. He had killed them all. Dozens of officials lay in pools of blood, and he had paid a price. Those generals had some ability, and Grand Secretary Chun had made preparations beforehand. He had invited a few powerful cultivators to pretend to be officials and enter the hall. The morning sun shone on his pale face. He looked at the distant sky outside the royal palace and thought of some things that had happened a long time ago and a long time later. History was always repeating itself. The only difference was that his cultivation level here was somewhat low. The young eunuch led the surviving officials out from the corner of the Great Hall. Looking at the pools of blood on the ground and thinking of the cruel and bloody scenes from before, the officials' legs turned to jelly. They forced themselves to walk out of the hall. Seeing the emperor covered in blood and holding a sword, they didn't dare to look him in the eye. With a few thuds, they knelt down. "If you can still walk, go and take care of this matter." Jing Jiao's voice was devoid of any emotion. The officials didn't dare to tarry. Propping themselves up with their hands, they walked out of the palace as fast as they could. There were still many things they needed to do. Comforting the imperial army was the first step, and rescuing the officials from the imperial prison was the second. There was a slight commotion outside the royal palace, but quickly calmed down. Before long, the palace gates were opened again. Dozens of officials came to the hall and knelt before Jing Jiao. These people had just left the imperial prison and were still wearing their prison uniforms. They looked extremely wretched. Great General Pei and Governor Zhou knelt at the very front. The former was Grand Secretary Zhang's most trusted general and had the highest prestige in the Chu kingdom. The latter's status was much lower, but he was the future prime minister that Grand Secretary Zhang had prepared for Jing Jiao. They had heard from their colleagues what had happened in the hall today and could not believe it. Only now, when they saw dozens of eunuchs and palace maids, under the command of a few eunuchs, splashing clean water into the hall and seeing the blood flowing out of the hall like a waterfall and flowing down the stone steps, did they confirm with shock that it was true. His Majesty had almost killed all the officials in the court. Jing Jiao looked at General Pei and said, "Go to the barracks outside the city. If there are any problems in the capital, directly extinguish them." General Pei's expression changed. Governor Zhou was worried that His Majesty did not understand the complexity of the current situation and said, "The capital camp will not listen to General Pei's orders. All the manors in the capital have long been prepared, and those princes and dukes will definitely not be content with their lot. Perhaps they will take advantage of the chaos to stir up trouble. Your Majesty, you are the people chosen by the Grand Scholar. If you can't even handle such a small matter, his judgment is a bit too poor." Thinking of Grand Secretary Chun, who had died in the hall, and Prime President Jean, who had died the day before, Jing Jiao realized that Grand Secretary Zhang's judgment was indeed not very good, except that he had understood him. In short, don't bother me with such trifles, not today and not in the future. In this aspect, you should learn from him. Having said this, he turned around and walked toward the cold palace. Zhuo Ruzhui yawned and followed him out. The rusted lock had been removed, and the side door, which was used to deliver miscellaneous goods, had been sealed shut. Other than this, the cold palace had not changed much. It was still as cold and cheerless as ever. Jing Jiao threw the badly damaged sword into the pool, changed his clothes, and leaned back on the bed. The blood on his body had long since been washed clean. Standing in front of the bed, Rujui said, "If I hadn't lost my arm that time, I would have forgotten most of what had happened in the outside world." Jingjio said, "You're going to compete for the fairy book. The green sky mirror won't let you forget this, but it doesn't matter if you forget other things." "What are you going to do, Senior Master?" asked Rujui. "What about you?" asked Jingjio. "I still have the same idea, which is to cultivate and kill people here." Rujui said matter-of-factly, "If I kill all the other participants in the Tao competition, the fairy book will belong to Aoyama. Even if I fail, I won't have wasted the last few decades." Jingjio said, "I'm almost at the same level. The disciples of Aoyama were always straightforward in their actions, so it was not surprising that they had a similar plan." Yet, Rujui didn't understand why Jingjio hid in the royal palace every day if he wanted to cultivate and kill other participants in the Tao competition. Jingjio was fully aware that he wouldn't get an answer even if he asked Jingjio. He didn't know how helpless Tong Yin was when she died back then. He raised his hand and bowed to Jingjio, ready to leave. "Where are you going?" Jingjio asked. Rujui said, "I'm going to Zhao State to kill that eunuch." Jingjio said, "Hejan is a bit abnormal. Be careful." After Rujui left, it was even quieter in the palace hall. The capital would be in chaos that day. It was unclear if General Pei, Governor Zhou, and the others could stabilize the situation, and it was also unclear how many people would die in the end. Sitting on the bed, Jingjio looked at the sky outside the window in silence. He maintained his posture for a long time. No one knew what he was thinking, but it probably had nothing to do with the chaos in the capital. As the sky shifted, people would occasionally come to the outside of the palace hall to report on the current situation. Interestingly enough, the messenger was not the young eunuch, but the eldest young Master Zhang. Perhaps in the eyes of General Pei, Governor Zhou, and the others, the eldest young Master Zhang was the person whom His Majesty trusted the most. Jingjio didn't reply. He continued to look outside the window in silence. The sun gradually set. After dusk came night, and the light in the palace hall grew dim. At some point, a lamp was lit in the palace hall. Flutter, flutter. The blue bird flapped its wings and flew into the palace hall. It landed on the bed and turned into that cute little girl. Jingjio asked, "Is it settled?" Chinger said, "The rebellion in the barracks and the imperial army outside the city has been suppressed by Pei Siming. The residences of the ministers are under control. You don't have to worry." Jingjio said, "I didn't." Chinger said with slight annoyance, "Those people outside like to watch the chaos of war, so I can use those scenes to fool them. But I have to show them some scenes of you. I remember you saying that I cultivate and sleep here every day. Those people outside the Huin Valley have long since grown tired of seeing me. But the scene of you killing people in the palace hall today is what they like to see the most. I didn't show it, and I don't know how many complaints I've caused. Scenes that can't be seen directly might be even more exciting. That makes sense. No wonder there are so many good reviews. No need to thank me. You don't have to be so polite." Ching said somewhat angrily, "Don't always have me be a messenger in the future. What if Bai Jinren becomes suspicious?" Jingjio said, "I'll be careful." The dim light fell on his body. Because he had killed people during the day, his face was a bit pale, and his expression was a bit tired. His black hair draped over his shoulders, displaying a kind of decadent beauty. Seeing this scene, Ching was in a trance. She came back to her senses after a while, and exclaimed in surprise, "You've lit a lamp?" Jingjio uttered, This palace hall was seldom lit by a lamp. It was not until a few days ago, when the Grand Secretary Zhang came here before his death, that the lamp was lit. Thinking of what had happened in the last few days, Chinger asked confusedly, "You've been concentrating on cultivation and don't care about other things. Why are you willing to do it this time?" Jingjio said, "Cultivation requires a quiet place. What I did was no different from a bear getting rid of the thread outside its cave." Chinger asked while looking at him, "Is that true? Is that all?" "Of course," Jingjio said. Chinger curled her lips and said, "Maybe it's true, but I still think that your action has something to do with the Grand Secretary. Maybe it's true, Jingjiu said. Qing Er's eyes lit up as she asked, "What's so different about the Grand Secretary? For him, you are fake, but for you, well, he might be real. No, since you will leave the illusionary realm and will probably never come back in this lifetime. And even if you come back, you won't be able to see him again. So, he is also fake to you, right?" There are too many truths and falsehoods in this statement, and it was hard to tell the truth from the falsehood. Chinger stared into his eyes and said, "According to what you said, those who leave and never come back are all fake. But why did you do it?" Looking at the dim lamp, Jing Jio said, "Because there are many things in the world that have nothing to do with what is true and what is false." It was quiet outside the Huyin Valley. The light screen in the sky was still in that scene. The dim lamp in the palace hall was fading away, and the lights in the capital city were brightly lit. The hooves of the cavalrymen trod on the green stone road, and the cries grew softer. Nobody had heard the conversation between the bluebird and Jingjiu, but they had seen the whole story. No matter how calm the cultivation practitioners were, they would still feel a bit frustrated when they saw the lights in the scene and thought of the joys and sorrows they had seen the past 30 days. Sensei's eyes were wet, but it was unclear if she was crying for Jingjiu and Grand Secretary Zhang, or for some other reason. Standing by a cliff in the distance, Tong Yin fell silent for a long time, thinking of what Jingjiu had said in the end. Those were all fake. The cultivation practitioners had all heard similar words in their pursuit of the Tao. They might come from their masters or their colleagues, but they were not as certain as what Jingjiu had said. Many cultivation practitioners would have the illusion that they could come into contact with reality by recognizing the falsehood, and they would be able to sever their emotions and nature. But as Jingjiu had said, there were many things in the world that had nothing to do with what was true and what was false. Who could really sever their emotions and nature? In other words, why should they sever their emotions and nature? The footsteps burst out behind the cliff. Tong Yin turned around and found it was the thin and dark disciple of the No Mercy sect. "What do you think of what your young master said?" she asked suddenly. Chapter 396. Normally, Lu Shui should have turned around and left, or tried to contact the immortal sect master. For some reason, he didn't leave, but started to seriously consider Tong Yan's question. It didn't take long for him to give his answer. "I have no opinion on young master's words." Tong Yin said. Before he said this today, everyone thought that Jingjiu cultivated the unfeeling path. "Aren't you worried?" Lu Shui didn't understand, asking, "Worried about what?" Tong Yin said, "How can we travel together when we have different paths?" Lu Shui understood what he meant and said with relief, "No matter what path it is, it's fine as long as we can go up the mountain. Why do we have to travel together?" Tong Yin looked at him in silence for a while and suddenly said, "You are the smart one." Lu Shui explained, "I'm not stupid. It's just that young master is too smart, which makes me look stupid." Tong Yin raised her eyebrows and asked, "What do you think about the outcome of the Tao competition?" Lu Shui said, "The fairy book is of course young master's." Tong Yin thought it was unnecessary to ask this question, so she suddenly asked, "Aren't you worried that I'll expose your identity?" The whole cultivation world thought that Lu Shui had been imprisoned in the sword jail to reflect on his actions. If people knew that he had left, the 9 peaks of Aoyama would be in chaos. For instance, Fong Jingtian, the master of Shilai Peak, who was watching the competition not far away, would definitely take this opportunity to make trouble. Lu Shui knew that Tong Yin was trying to test something, such as whether the immortal sect master knew about it. Since he didn't leave, he must have thought of a way to deal with it. Looking at Tong Yin, he said with a smile, "Back then, Miss Baizeo said that the Zhongzhou school owed me a favor. I'll use it here." Tong Yin knew that this matter was related to Lo Huainan's death, but she didn't expect that Lu Shui would bring it up at this time. Was he playing dumb or something? He looked at Lu Shui and discovered that Lu Shui's smile was actually so sincere. He couldn't help but laugh at himself, thinking that it was indeed meaningless to be smart before sincerity. He didn't say anything else, nor did he look at the scene in the sky. He flew away. Lu Shui also left the edge of the cliff. Thinking of Jing Jiu's order, he naturally wouldn't go too far. Sensei wipes away the tears on her face. She can't bear to watch the story in that world anymore, so she asks Shui Yu Nunnery to accompany her out for a walk. However, the fishes in the valley suffer. 5 days later, after having eaten a dozen grilled fish, fish slices, fried fish, Sensei's mood had improved, and she returned to the valley. As she was talking to Shui Yu Nunnery about the delicious grilled fish cooked by Hejan, she lifted her head and saw Hejan's face in the sky. The face in the sky was not exactly the same as Hejan's true appearance. It was fairer, and he didn't have a single mustache on his face, which made him look more feminine. He wore a black overcoat, looking at a dozen generals kneeling in front of him, his eyes full of a cold and unyielding expression. What he said was even more shocking. The Chu Kingdom can hold on for another 5 years at most. You have to be prepared to take over the West Camp and that fertile land and the title of nobility. 1 day in the human world was 1 year in the illusionary realm. Sensei went to the Cloud Dream Mountain to play for 5 days. In the world of the Green Sky Mirror, the Grand Secretary Zhang had passed away 5 years ago. The 7 participants in the illusionary realm were already 35 years old. Bai Zhao and Bai Qianjun of the Zhongzhou School, Shi Yun of Yamatai, Hejan of the Guocheng Temple, and Jing Jiu and Zhu Ruzhui of the Aoyama sect were all talented disciples of the famous sections. Surprisingly, one of the participants was that free-traveling practitioner named Jiang Rue. The Bluebird would go and take a look at Jiang Rue once in a while. Jiang Rue was still trying his best to climb up the ranks in the county, and it seemed that he had a hard time. He didn't have any power or status, and his cultivation state wasn't very high either. The people couldn't understand why Hejan would allow this friend who had betrayed him to live until now, considering his current power and ruthlessness in the Zhao Kingdom. In comparison to the pitiful Jiang Rue, the other 6 participants played a more important role in the world of the Green Sky Mirror. The White Emperor had finally defeated the barbarians in the north a few times. He had beheaded many of them and captured a great number of war horses, as well as a few fertile grasslands. His prowess in martial arts could be considered unparalleled in the world. The cavalry of the Qin Kingdom was like the sharpest weapon. No other kingdom had the power to resist them, save for the Zhao Kingdom. The merchants and populace of the Qi Kingdom were obviously scared out of their wits. They sped up their overseas expeditions at a furious pace. In 5 years, they had discovered a few large islands and brought back a great amount of rare resources. As a result, they had prepared many routes of retreat while strengthening the strength of the kingdom. It was believed that they would soon discover the rumored alien land. The scholar named Yin Shi had left the education palace to travel and give lectures in the Qi Kingdom and the cities under its jurisdiction, and he had even gone overseas to educate the barbarians. As a result, he had gained a high reputation among the populace and had taken on thousands of disciples, including the important figures like the Qi Emperor and the ministers of state Zhao Kingdom. Those ministers of state Zhao Kingdom who were Yin Shi's disciples were actually well aware of what they had in mind. They intended to intimidate the imperial court with the help of the glamorous appearance of Yin Shi, but they soon realized their mistake. It was because the Intelligence Bureau had ruthlessly attacked them in the officialdom and the properties of their clans. Elder He was still the ruler of the Zhao Kingdom. All the decrees were issued by him, not by the emperor, nor by the Empress Dowager, who was hiding behind the bead curtain. It was so absurd that the world could not tolerate it. The wise and righteous people of the Zhao Kingdom launched waves of attacks again and again, but the eunuch had the loyalty of the generals from all over the kingdom, so he didn't care about these attacks. As for the assassinations carried out by the officials and the merchants of the Qi Kingdom, they didn't have any effect. The assassins couldn't even break through the defense of the eunuchs and get to Elder He. As for poisoning, the Intelligence Bureau would never allow such an absurd thing to happen. The only real danger that Hejan faced was from the man in black who had returned from the West regions. Zhuo Ruzhui had chosen the perfect place to strike. It was not a county with relatively weak defense, nor was it a busy street in the capital. Instead, It was the Intelligence Bureau. He waited for 7 days on the beam of the cleanest latrine in the Intelligence Bureau, which had a golden-laid toilet. He fell asleep 30 times out of boredom and drowsiness. Finally, Hejan showed up. It was a thrilling battle. The Intelligence Bureau was in a mess, as if a gale had swept through it. More than 20 eunuchs were killed on the spot. Zhuo Ruzhui had once again proved that he was the most powerful swordsman in the world after Duke Missouri. Hejan's strange body movements, powerful combat strength, and especially his terrifying willpower in the assassination had once again made the officials of the Zhao Kingdom and the merchants of the Qi Kingdom feel hopeless. In the end, Hejan was seriously injured and had disappeared for more than 20 days. Rumor had it that he had been hiding in the Empress Dowager's palace. Zhuo Ruzhui was also seriously injured. He was almost drowned in the ocean when he was pursued by the Intelligence Bureau and the cavalrymen of the Zhao Kingdom. Fortunately, he was rescued by a scholar from the royal palace of the Qi Kingdom. It took only 3 days for the news to reach the Chu Kingdom, but it took 17 days for it to reach the royal palace in Jingjiao. It was difficult for an emperor who was isolated from the outside world to know what was happening outside the royal palace. Of course, there was nothing he wanted to know. Grand Secretary Zhang had made a lot of preparations before his death. The national treasury and the palace treasury were full. As long as there was no more turmoil in the officialdom, it would be easy for the imperial court to get back on track. After the bloodbath in the Grand Hall, Governor Zhou promoted himself to a grand scholar, and Jing Jiu handed the royal seal to him. The other officials were also given important positions. The eldest young Master Zhang was appointed by Jing Jiu to be the chief of Taichung Temple. As for whether this appointment had anything to do with the state duke in Zhaoga City, it was unclear. General Pei was outside, and the grand scholar Zhou was inside. The emperor was still not in charge of the affairs of Chu State. The populace of Chu State was living a comfortable life, as if they had returned to the time when the grand scholar Zhang was still alive and another grand event was taking place. However, those who understood the situation could tell that Chu State was on the verge of collapse. This kingdom looked prosperous on the outside, but its internal problems had gradually become evident. The excessive spending, the redundant officials, the corruption, the lax governance, and all kinds of other problems would break out soon. Who would deal with them then? The sad fact was that the Chu Kingdom might have already been dealt with before these problems could be dealt with. The first person to target the Chu Kingdom was the White Emperor of the Qin Kingdom, who had taken it upon himself to conquer the ocean and unify the world. It was on the day when the cavalrymen of the Qin Kingdom marched southward that he arrived at the border between the Zhao State and the Chu Kingdom. Looking at the fertile fields on the other side of the mountains and the vaguely visible West Camp, he made the famous statement. The West Camp was guarded by General Pei in person. Even though the Qin Kingdom had already sent out the army, the imperial court didn't ask him to go to the north. It was to guard against the Zhao State. Hejan was not in a hurry. No matter how powerful a person was, he would die sooner or later. He could wait. He estimated that the Chu Kingdom could hold on for at most 5 years, because General Pei could live for at most 5 years. Everybody seemed to have forgotten that General Pei was only 3 years younger than Grand Secretary Zhang. The Qin Kingdom began to attack the Chu Kingdom. The strange thing was that the cavalrymen of the Qin Kingdom, who were known for their ferocity, were extremely cautious this time. It was unknown whether they were afraid of the hidden strength of the Chu Kingdom or worried that the Zhao State would try to take the millet from the fire. They fought steadily and surely. They even took the initiative to withdraw at the end of spring. It took them 4 years to advance 300 miles southward. Jingzhou didn't care about the affairs of the world, but if he wanted to cultivate in the imperial palace, he had to pay attention to this matter. Every once in a while, he would read the summary of the military information presented by the imperial court. From the information, he drew an interesting conclusion. The Qin army seemed to maintain a certain rhythm. It was this rhythm that effectively controlled the attack of the Qin army and ensured that the war would not go out of control. It was obvious that the upper echelons of the Qin Kingdom wanted an intact Chu Kingdom, not a broken Chu Kingdom. Only in this way could they, after conquering the Chu kingdom, completely digest the national and military strength of the Chu kingdom in the shortest time possible, and gain an absolute advantage in the final war against the Zhao state. The problem was that it wasn't something an ordinary person could do to make hundreds of thousands of cavalrymen act according to a certain rhythm. It required extremely brilliant leadership, planning, and meticulous operation. The White Emperor's art of war was godly, but he was too violent and bloodthirsty. He shouldn't be able to do such a thing. He sensed that it should be by Zhao's doing. There was no such thing as a princess in distress who was imprisoned in the palace. There was only the person in power behind the scenes in the Qin kingdom, just like he was in the Chu kingdom. After confirming that the entire strategy was made by Zhao, Jingjiao was even more certain of what the Qin kingdom wanted to do. Unfortunately, he couldn't change it. In the winter of the 4th year of the war between Qin and Chu, on an ordinary day, General Pei closed his eyes in his tent and left with Grand Secretary Zhang. This news was like a fire, igniting the wild grass that had been growing crazily in the wilderness for 4 years. Those wild grass were ambitious. The 70,000 cavalrymen of the Qin kingdom left Sangzhou and headed south. They didn't care about the loss of their troops and the harassment of the Chu kingdom along the way. They charged almost crazily toward the capital of the Chu kingdom. Chapter 397. The death of General Pei directly changed the situation of the world. The cavalry of the Qin kingdom broke through several defenses of the Chu kingdom's army and soon passed Baihe County. The capital was in sight. The reason why the army could advance so smoothly was that the Qin army was too powerful and the Chu army was not strong enough. There was another important reason. The vanguard of the Qin army was the army of Jing of Silla. They knew the Chu kingdom too well and hated the imperial court. Under the silent attack of Zhao state, the West camp didn't hold on for too long. The elite army that had been through hundreds of battles had lost its backbone. The speed of its collapse was faster than what everybody, including He Zhan and the generals of Zhao state, had imagined. As the remnants of Chu state fled and retreated, the white banners of General Pei's death were still hung up in the camp. Whether from Baihe County or the West camp to the capital of the Chu kingdom, it was a vast plain. The land was fertile, but there was no danger. The Chu kingdom had lost its power. The news of the war kept coming back to the capital. The air was filled with tension and despair. The people stood on the street and read the notices, numb and confused. The officials in the court and the ministries looked away, not knowing where they were looking. The scholars of the academy were no longer in high spirits. They held their scrolls and looked into the distance in a daze. No one knew what they were thinking. The business of the brothels became very good. Every night, the buildings on the banks of the rivers and lakes were brightly lit and full. At the moment of the survival of the nation, in the face of sorrow and despair, they could only drink every night and live a befuddled life. It seemed to be understandable for the Chu people. The bluebird flew over the night sky of the capital and looked down at these strange scenes and people. It landed in the deepest part of the imperial palace. There were no lights in the hall. It was very dark. One could clearly see the lights outside the imperial palace in the night sky. The blue bird walked to the end of the wide couch and looked into Jingjiao's eyes. "You don't have time," Jingjiao uttered, saying nothing. If there were no Qin, Zhao, Qi, and the other countries, the Chu people could live well, but with strong enemies, there would be problems. If the Grand Scholar Zhang were still alive, this day might come a little later. But he was dead, and now even General Pei was dead. No one could control life and death, not even Jingjiao. Even in the real world outside the green sky mirror, all he could do was try his best to control his own life and death, but he couldn't affect others. The Jing family in Zhaoga City, like the Liu couple in the small village, would die one day. The blue bird looked into his eyes in silence and did not turn into a little girl. Soon, it would leave again to witness the magnificent scene of the army of the Qin kingdom marching south on behalf of the cultivators in the outside world. Jingjiao was silent for a while. He flicked his finger, and the oil lamp on the pillar was lit. A moment later, the sound of footsteps came from outside the hall. The young eunuch was kneeling on the ground, waiting for orders. Jing Jiu said, "Tell the people outside the palace that I will attend the court meeting tomorrow." It wasn't even dawn yet. It was pitch black in the sky, except for the remnants of the joyful and despairing lights. The sound of wheels rolling over the green stone slabs could be heard on the road. Many carriages came from the south of the city and gathered on the straight road in front of the royal palace. Some carriages stopped, and the officials pulled up the curtains and stared at each other speechlessly, or discussed in a low voice, guessing each other's thoughts, and more importantly, the emperor's thoughts. In fact, under the current circumstances, many officials, including the scholars and populace, had the same thought: to surrender. Under the attack of Qin and Zhao, the Chu kingdom couldn't hold on any longer, not to mention that the West Camp, which was their last stronghold, was gone. The White Emperor was extremely cruel, and eunuch he was cold and perverted. If the Chu kingdom really persisted and angered these two, it would probably lead to a scene of rivers of blood, and even a massacre of the entire city might happen. At the moment, the vanguard of the Qin kingdom was Jing of Silla's army, and many of them were Chu people. It was better to surrender to them than to the foreigners. Jing of Silla and his subordinates couldn't be too extreme. The Qin kingdom even had to help the Chu people block the Zhao light cavalry of the West Camp, if they still wanted to unify the world. No matter how one looked at it, surrender was the only choice for the Chu kingdom, and the sooner they surrendered, the better the result would be. This thought lingered in the minds of all the officials and couldn't be erased. But they didn't tell their colleagues or their friends. Even the people closest to them didn't know what they were thinking. It was because whoever proposed to surrender first would be the greatest sinner in the history of the Chu kingdom. Nobody was willing to die with such a reputation. It was better to die in the wine vat in the brothel. The most important issue was what to do with the emperor. Negotiating with Jing of Silla to surrender was the best choice for the Chu kingdom. But Jing of Silla would definitely kill the emperor to avenge his son. With all kinds of thoughts and guesses about the emperor's mind, the officials walked into the royal palace silently, like the suffocating fishes, lining up in 2 rows in the grand hall. Sitting on the highest throne was a man wearing a bright yellow royal robe. His black hair was tied up behind his head with a cloth band, exposing his handsome face. They hadn't seen this scene for a long time, reminding some chancellors of the bloody rebellion in the palace 5 years ago. Some of them looked pale because of fear, and some of them felt hopeful, their pale faces flushed. The Grand Scholar Zhou was one of them, who hadn't been home for 50 days because of the state affairs and the wars. Jing Jiu's gaze swept over the faces of the officials. He saw the fear in their eyes, which came from the officials of the Ministry of War, who were afraid of being appointed. He saw the excitement in their eyes, which came from the officials of the royal censor, who thought he was going to lead the army in person. He also saw the fear in their eyes, which came from those people who had evil intentions and were afraid that the bloody events would happen again. Most of all, he saw the numbness and the boredom after they had accepted their fate in despair. It was deathly quiet in the grand hall until Jing Jiu said, "Draw up the decree. This emperor approves it." The chancellors were startled. They eyed each other speechlessly, not understanding what the emperor meant. What decree was he going to draw up? What was he going to approve? "We can negotiate however we want, but not with Sangzhou. Let the messenger from Xianying come here." Having said this, Jing Jiu got up from the throne and left the grand hall. It was deathly quiet in the grand hall. The officials didn't realize what they had heard until the figure in bright yellow had disappeared in the deep end of the grand hall. Did the emperor mean surrender? The officials were stunned, speechless, feeling complicated emotions. They eyed each other, not knowing what to do. The Grand Scholar Zhou sighed, his eyes full of pain and remorse. He felt that he had failed Grand Secretary Zhang and the populace of Chu Kingdom, and that he had put the emperor in such a difficult situation. It was even more unforgivable for him to die 10,000 times. He was fully aware why the emperor called for a court meeting and made such a declaration to the chancellors of the imperial court. The Chu kingdom would be defeated for sure. Surrendering was the best choice, but none of the chancellors dared make such a decision. Like those stories in history, Everybody knew that the chancellors and populace could surrender when two states were at war, but the emperors couldn't. The emperor proposed surrendering voluntarily because he didn't want the chancellors of the imperial court to shoulder the responsibility of history and solve the current chaotic situation as soon as possible. This was a wise and clear-cut decision, but which emperor would be willing to make such a decision? What the grand scholar Zhou could think of, those smart officials of the imperial court couldn't think of. After a long moment of silence, a few cries suddenly broke out in the grand hall. Even those officials who weren't crying had red eyes, their faces full of regret and pain, though it was hard to tell if it was true or not. The chief of Taichung Temple abruptly turned around and stared at these useless officials, yelling sternly, "Come on! His Majesty is still alive." The mother of the eldest young Master Zhang had passed away 4 years ago. He was an old man now, with silver hair on his head, but he looked much more awe-inspiring than before, even resembling the style of his father. Hearing his stern yell, the cries in the grand hall had finally stopped. The chancellors came back to their senses and looked at the grand scholar Zhou in tandem. The lips of the grand scholar Zhou trembled a few times, and he squeezed out a sentence with difficulty. Negotiate peace with the Qin state. All the royal army will be mobilized in the direction of the West Camp. Then he stared at those officials sternly and said in a cold voice, "Nobody is allowed to talk about this outside. Don't tell me that you can't conceal it. Conceal it for as long as you can. Do you hear me?" A delegation of the Qin kingdom entered the capital of the Chu kingdom secretly. According to the request of the Chu kingdom, Jing Silla didn't show up, but there were many people from Tsangzhou in the delegation. Some officials of the imperial court had many ideas. They tried their best to get acquainted with those people, whether they were of the same age or from the same hometown, in order to protect themselves, and they even hoped to get a better position in the new imperial court. Those people from Tsangzhou had been the officials of the Chu kingdom, but they were the officials chosen by the crown prince Jing Tongyan herself. They met the officials of the imperial court with an insincere smile. Only when their gazes fell on the royal palace would they show a hint of coldness and hatred. No matter how secretive the delegation was, it was impossible to conceal it from everybody. The news had spread out in the capital, and a storm had arisen. The grand scholar Zhou, who was known for his benevolence, finally showed some of the courage of the grand secretary Zhang back then. He killed 3 chancellors forcefully to stabilize the situation for the time being. The so-called negotiation of peace was a surrender. The Chu kingdom didn't have much confidence, and the Qin kingdom was pressing forward. It was hard to settle the negotiation in a short time. However, both sides knew that the emperor of the Chu kingdom had to abdicate the throne without any negotiation. The sky couldn't have 2 suns, and the country couldn't have 2 rulers. If the White Emperor wanted to be the ruler of the world, he wouldn't allow Jing Jiao to sit on the throne. The best outcome for Jing Jiao was to obtain the nominal title of king and be guarded by a large number of soldiers. When the populace of the Chu kingdom had gradually forgotten him, he would be slowly poisoned to death, starved to death, or accidentally drowned in the water, like his father. It was then that a decree suddenly came out from the deep end of the royal palace. The emperor wanted to have a talk with the delegation of the Qin kingdom in person. As soon as the decree came out, many officials and those people from Tsangzhou in the delegation of the Qin kingdom felt disdainful, wondering what kind of terms the emperor of the Qin kingdom, who had lost his kingdom, would ask for at this moment. A bigger manor house or a room full of fine wine, or a 16-year-old concubine and a room full of good wine. One early morning, a few officials of the delegation of the Qin kingdom entered the royal palace and came to the tranquil grand hall. Jing Jiao waved his hand, motioning for all the eunuchs and palace maids to leave. The officials of the Qin kingdom thought of some rumors, and their expressions changed slightly. Then they thought, even if you kill all of us, what use will it be? At this moment, an ordinary-looking official of the Qin kingdom suddenly said, "All of you leave first." The officials of the Qin kingdom looked a little uneasy, but they didn't dare to oppose and left the grand hall as they were told. Jingju looked at the official of the Qin kingdom and said, "I didn't expect it to be you." The official of the Qin kingdom raised her head and removed her disguise, revealing a beautiful and pleasant face. She smiled sweetly at him. If I hadn't come this time, I probably wouldn't have seen you again. It's over. A voice suddenly came from behind the pillar. This time, it was no longer lazy, but rather exasperated. Zhuo Rizhui walked out and looked at Jing Jiu angrily. Since it's her who has come, then hurry up and pack your bags. Let's go. Chapter 398. Two readers have guessed the title of this chapter, and then, what else can I do? I can only write it like this. I turned around silently. The official from the Qin kingdom was a woman. She was in high spirits, and her eyes were bright. She had a natural beauty about her. She was able to drive all the officials of the Qin kingdom out of the palace with a single word, especially those from Sangzhou. Her status in Xianyang was naturally very high, and she was acquainted with Tongyan. This confirmed her identity. Of course, she had never thought of concealing her identity from Jingjiu. Otherwise, she would not have taken the risk to come here. Seeing Zhu Ruzhui flash out from behind the pillar, Bai Zhao tilted his head slightly and asked in confusion, "What are you doing here?" Zhu Ruzhui said listlessly, "I can't do anything now." Thinking of Zhu Ruzhui's words, she vaguely guessed something. She looked at Jingjiu uncertainly and asked, "Are you waiting for him?" "Yes," Jingjiu answered. Bai Zhao was very confused, saying, "He is the emperor of the Qin kingdom. Now that the Chu kingdom is powerless to resist, why would he take the risk to come here?" Jingjiu said, "Your big brother is a very proud person. He should be very happy to come here and see how I look when I surrender." Bai Zhao shook his head and said, "Being proud doesn't mean that he will get carried away." Jingjiu said, "According to my calculation, he may not get carried away, but he will get carried away." There was obviously a deeper meaning in this statement. After a moment of silence, Bai Zhao asked, "How did you guess?" Jingjiu said, "Calculating is not guessing." Bai Zhao looked him in the eyes and said, "But in the end, you still got it wrong." Beside him, Zhu Rizhui nodded vigorously. Jingjiu said, "If you don't come, he will." Of course, this is not absolute. Bai Zhao recalled his quarrel with his senior brother in the palace of Xianyang. After a moment of silence, he said, "If he comes, what do you want to do?" Zhuo Ruzhui was baffled and said, "Are you going to treat him to a meal?" "Kill him, of course." Bai Zhao glanced at him and said, "Are you sure you can kill him?" "I'm very strong." Zhuo Ruzhui said, "Moreover, this is not Xianyang. He does not have the 3,000 soldiers to protect him. He will die for sure." He did not mention a certain person, but both he and Bai Zhao knew that Jingjiu was also very strong. Bai Zhao said, "Now that I'm here, you can kill me." If she were just an unfortunate princess of the previous dynasty, it would be meaningless to kill her. But if she were just an ordinary princess, why would the officials of the Qin kingdom listen to her? Jingjiu had long guessed that the Qin kingdom's plans in the world must have originated from her and Tongyan's plans. In recent years, the Qin kingdom's strategy of invading the south must have been arranged by her. Her status and role in the Qin kingdom were very important. Therefore, killing her or using her to threaten the White Emperor would be meaningful for the Chu kingdom. But he did not say anything, nor did he make a move. As I said at the beginning, since it's you who came, it's over, Zhu Ruzhui said angrily. "Although I'm in seclusion on the top of Tingguang Peak, I know the relationship between you. Why would he kill you?" Whether it was a young lady in a boudoir or a fairy-like cultivation practitioner, when they heard this kind of talk, they would feel displeased or ashamed. But Bai Zhao was delighted. He secretly gave Zhu Ruzhui a thumbs up to show his appreciation. Looking at the scallion finger, Zhu Ruzhui felt even more helpless. He turned to Jingjiu and said, "All these years, I've been killing people outside, and you've been in power in the Chu kingdom. 2 against 2. It seems very promising. But now your kingdom is going to be destroyed, and I'm getting old here. What should I do next?" Jingjiu thought about it and said, "I haven't decided yet." Zhu Ruzhui said, "Now it seems that your plan is wrong. At least there's not enough time to prove it." I have to do it my own way. Having said that, he turned around and walked out of the hall. The breeze ruffled his empty sleeves and hair, and there were several strands of white hair in them. Zhuo Rujui's figure disappeared in the morning light. The hall was quiet for a moment. Bai Zhao walked to the front of Jing Jiao and asked while staring into his eyes, "What did he mean by plan?" "You're so smart that you should be able to guess it," said Jing Jiao. "The people who understood you the most were not your lovers or your enemies, but those who were qualified to be your opponents. In the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror, the person who had guessed Jing Jiao's plan and had the ability to stop him from carrying it out was Tong Yan. Back then, Jing Jiao would rather give Sangzhou to the Qin kingdom to kill Tong Yan because he wanted to gain more time. He had fought for 10 years, but unfortunately, he didn't succeed. "Do you intend to break through the cultivation state here?" Bai Zhao exclaimed with an incredulous expression. Jing Jiao turned around and walked to the back of the hall without saying a word. Following behind Jing Jiao, Bai Zhao said, "It's impossible. Even though you're an unparalleled genius and don't want to follow the normal path, the rules are still the rules." Jing Jiao still didn't say anything. He came to the bedroom, took off the hairband, sat on the bed, and took out a few pieces of paper. His black hair spread out like a waterfall, forming a sharp contrast with the snow-like white paper. Seeing this scene, Bai Zhao smiled faintly and sat on the bed, saying, "No matter what you think, I've won." "Not necessarily," Jingju said calmly while staring at her eyes. Bai Zhao felt his face was a bit hot, but he didn't avert his eyes bravely. Many years ago, he and Bai Zhao met on this bed when they were 2 or 3 years old. Now that they were grown up, this bed became much smaller. They were right in front of each other, and they were indeed very close. Jing Jiao handed over the paper in his hand and said, "My conditions." Bai Zhao didn't take the paper, but looked at Jing Jiao's face. Suppressing her embarrassment, she said, "It's all up to you." She wasn't showing off her leniency as a victor, but she knew that Jing Jiao would naturally decide to surrender and wouldn't put forward too harsh conditions. She explained it to herself in this way. The blue bird on the branch outside the window had already turned its head to look into the distance. In an inconspicuous storeroom of a trading house, Zhuo Rujui was cutting his hair. He twisted his hair into a very messy and short haircut, and then he began to carefully install an iron arm on himself. The peace talk soon ended because the Qin kingdom had agreed to most of the conditions of the Chu kingdom. But since it was a surrender, those conditions were only minor details. The name of the kingdom would definitely be changed, and the army would definitely be reorganized. The capital of the Chu kingdom would be changed to the southern part, guarded by the Sangzhou army. Jing of Silla would be conferred the title of King of the South, and he might live in the royal palace. The real benefits for the Chu kingdom were in taxes, laws, jurisdiction, and so on. In other words, all the benefits belonged to the people. Given the ruthlessness of the White Emperor, it was not easy for the negotiation to reach such a result. But when the result of the negotiation began to spread in the capital of the Chu kingdom and beyond, it still caused a great disturbance. It was because the collapse of the kingdom was a humiliation and pain that few people could bear. Jing Jiao, who was conferred the title of King of Linshan, became the symbol of humiliation and was laughed at by the world. The capital of the Chu kingdom was filled with cries and curses. All the scholars and talents began to display their talents to their heart's content, writing poems to describe the sorrow of the collapse of the kingdom and their anger at the incompetent and muddle-headed emperor. Perhaps even they themselves didn't realize that there was a certain feeling of relief hidden behind those poems. The Flowing Cloud House was the most popular brothel in the capital of the Chu kingdom, and Miss Yun was the most popular girl in the Flowing Cloud House. Those who could let her stay with them must be the richest or the most powerful playboys. Tonight, she was accompanying the young prince of the Prince Cheng's mansion. The young prince drank a lot of wine, and in his drunkenness, he commented on the affairs of the court for half the night. He spent 80% of his time criticizing the emperor for being muddle-headed and incompetent and for handing over the great state left by his ancestors to others. In the past, Even though the emperor had always been known as an idiot and lived in seclusion in the palace, no one dared to criticize him like this. But the situation was different now. Everyone knew that the Chu kingdom was about to collapse, and the emperor would probably live only a few years. No one would care about these trivial things. Before the young prince passed out, he didn't forget to mention the relationship between his family and the Jing of Silla. The princes and nobles in the capital were all relatives of the Jing of Silla. But according to the young prince's proud statement, his father, the Prince Chung, was a good brother of the Jing of Silla, and they were very close friends. Even after the Jing of Silla betrayed the Qin kingdom, they didn't cut off contact. In the future, there would definitely be a place for him in the new Qin kingdom. Miss Yin looked at the sleeping young prince in silence for a long time. Suddenly, she took out a small knife and cut his neck. Then, she took out a writing brush, dipped it in his blood, and wrote a short poem. That poem described the pain of the subjugation of the country and her hatred for the civil and military officials in the imperial court and the Emperor of Chu. One of the lines in the poem was, "Not a single man." The young prince was killed by a prostitute. Even when the country was destroyed and the world turned upside down, it was still a major event that shook the capital. Miss Yin was imprisoned. Even if that poem, especially that line, quickly spread in the capital, she couldn't escape the fate of being executed by 1,000 cuts. At this moment, a eunuch quietly entered the prison and brought her out. The eunuch took her in a carriage and left the capital overnight. After traveling for several days and nights, they arrived outside the West Barracks and joined the Zhao army. The carriage was sent directly to the central military tent. Wearing a black cloak, Eunuch Hejan walked to the front of the carriage and lifted the curtain. Looking at the prostitute with a pale face and picturesque eyebrows, he frowned and said nothing. These were all trivial matters. The subjugation of the Chu kingdom was a major event. Jingjiu was originally a famous idiot emperor. Now, he had confirmed his identity as a fatuous emperor. Of course, he couldn't get rid of the title of the subjugation of the country. The people of Chu were good at writing. Suddenly, countless poems and songs appeared to denounce him. The words in those poems were marvelous and impassioned. Even the distant education palace of the Qi kingdom had written a few poems denouncing his wrongdoings and alluding to what had happened to Zhao. Surprisingly, Mr. Yin Qi didn't think so. On the contrary, he gave the emperor of Chu a high evaluation. It could even be said that he praised him highly. The delegation of the Qin kingdom had returned to Xianying in secret. Dozens of days later, accompanied by the autumn rain, Jingjiu Silla led the army of the Qin kingdom to the outside of the capital of the Chu kingdom, ready to take over the government officially. It was then that the people outside the capital suddenly found a band of black smoke rising up in the city, which should be in the direction of the royal palace. The grand scholar Zhou passed out after seeing the black smoke in front of his eyes. Jingjiu Silla narrowed his eyes, reflecting on something. Chapter 399. Countless people swarmed into the royal palace, but they couldn't do anything while looking at the palace hall engulfed by the flames. It was useless even if a rainstorm came down from the sky. The eunuchs and the palace servant girls stood around in a daze. Some of them had already cried bitterly, and a few eunuchs looked bewildered, thinking that they were good at washing the blood left by the emperor in this palace hall. Now that the palace hall had been burned down and the emperor had passed away, what else could they do? The fire was so big that it was impossible to put out. It didn't die down until 3 days and 3 nights later. The soldiers rushed into the ruins to search for the emperor, but they found that the gold and silver inlaid on the beams had all been melted into solidified lava. It was impossible to find the corpse of the Chu emperor. Overnight, many residential houses were hung up with white banners, and the whole capital looked like it was covered with a snowfall. After the white emperor learned of the matter, he ordered the emperor to be buried with the honors of a king. The grand scholar Zhou was seriously ill. He resigned as soon as he recovered, and his whereabouts were unknown. The chief of Taichung Temple had already brought the entire clan of the former Grand Scholar Manor back to their hometown. Nobody had the heart to criticize the emperor for his incompetence and cowardice anymore. The king had died for the state. What more could they ask of him? Many populace had gradually recalled the situation when the emperor and the Grand Secretary Zhang were in power, and they felt nostalgic about it. How many emperors could be like the emperor who never went out of the palace and never caused trouble? Nostalgia for the past often meant dissatisfaction with the present. Nobody was willing to accept the brutal and forceful rule of the Qin kingdom. Many scholars changed the direction of their writing and wrote many sad poems to mourn the passing of the emperor in the fire. Many populace insisted that the emperor didn't die in the first place, and that he had escaped by taking advantage of the fire. He was living in seclusion in some place, either as a monk or plotting how to recover the former state. The palace halls in Xianyang City were all black. Set off by Aoyama in the distance, the palace looked quite desolate. It was soundless around the grand hall. Those soldiers in black armor, holding the long spears, seemed to be not breathing, which made the people feel intimidated. There was a patch of white in the grand hall, which was the most powerful man in the world, the White Emperor. Bai Zhao came to the palace hall. Naturally, there were many colors because she was also wearing a white dress. You know he's not dead, so why did you come back? Bai Qianjun stared into her eyes and asked. Bai Zhao looked back at him calmly and said, "Are you questioning me?" Bai Qianjun put his hand on his forehead and said, "My apologies, I'm a little tired from managing the affairs of the state." A few years ago, he had said that he wanted to forget some things. Bai Zhao remembered. His eyelids drooped slightly, but his long eyelashes did not tremble. Bai Qianjun said, "We can't let him slip away like this. We must find his whereabouts and confirm whether he's dead or alive. Capture all the eunuchs and palace maids in the imperial palace of the Chu kingdom, as well as those high-ranking officials. We will definitely get something by torturing them. We don't believe that he didn't leave any traces behind." "This is inappropriate," Bai Zhao said. "Since the general situation has been decided, there is no need to care about these minor details, which will only cause more trouble." Bai Qianjun said, "Even though Yun Qi's reputation is high, it's useless to talk like a scholar, so we don't need to pay attention to him. Eunuch he is indeed difficult to deal with, but he is still a eunuch. When Zhao Huang grows up, Zhao will definitely run into trouble. All we need to do is wait. As for the Chu emperor, you have said many times that we should pay attention to him. Why is it that he is not considered the general situation now?" Bai Zhao said, "An emperor without a state is like a duckweed without roots. No matter how strong the wind is, it can only go with the flow. How can one person shake the world?" After a moment of silence, Bai Qian said, "What you said makes sense. I'm going to rest now." Bai Zhao walked toward the outside of the palace hall. Outside the palace hall, eunuch Gao saw her and hurriedly knelt down to pay his respect. She didn't even glance at him, nor did she pay any attention to those stern and powerful soldiers outside the palace hall. Arriving before the stone steps, she suddenly halted her steps, as if she had thought of something. She didn't turn around, but continued walking down the steps. Eunuch Gao came to the deep end of the black hall and knelt before the emperor, holding up a list of names with both hands. Bai Qianjun took the list and skimmed through it. His face darkened slightly. It was obvious that he was dissatisfied. "We can basically confirm that the Emperor of Chu didn't escape with the diplomatic group, but there are many things that we can't ask in detail." Eunuch Gao lowered his head as he spoke, his voice trembling slightly. As the chief supervisor of the royal palace of Xianyang, he was one of the few people who knew the real status of the princess in the Qin kingdom and her influence on the emperor. Eunuch Gao didn't dare offend the princess, so it was inconvenient for him to use tricks on the members of the diplomatic group. Bai Qianjun said in a slightly cold voice, "Bring all the members of the diplomatic group to the side hall. I want to see you interrogate them in person." The side hall was also completely black, and there was less light in it, making it appear even more gloomy. The officials and caretakers of the diplomatic group were escorted into the hall and turned to be interrogated by Eunuch Gao. They didn't notice the emperor sitting in the deep end of the hall. After the interrogation of those officials and caretakers, they still didn't find any problems. Next, it was the turn of the few managers of the trading companies. The diplomatic group of the Qin kingdom had secretly entered the Chu capital in the name of a trading company, so they had recruited a few managers to assist them. A manager of the trading company came into the side hall and walked up to Eunuch Gao. He bowed slightly, seemingly preparing to salute. In the deep end of the hall, Bai Qianjun, who was pretending to be asleep in the shadows, suddenly opened his eyes and looked at that person. The manager of the trading company looked somewhat thin, but the sound of his footsteps landing on the floor indicated that he was heavier than he looked. Bai Qianjun didn't have time to think about it, yelling, "Stop him!" Eunuch Gao's expression changed abruptly, blocking in front of the manager of the trading company without hesitation. The manager of the trading company bowed slightly. He wasn't preparing to salute, but rather was gathering his strength like a stiff bow that was gradually being pulled back. His feet stomped heavily on the floor, creating several cracks on the floor. His whole body shot out like an arrow released from a bow. Eunuch Gao was a highly skilled swordsman in the Xianyang royal palace, but before the thunderous power of the other party, he had no way to fight back. His face showed a look of terror. With a ripping sound, his body disappeared, turning into blood, flesh, and pieces of clothing that flew in the air. A flying sword pierced through the rain of blood, instantly arriving in front of Bai Qianjun. Bai Qianjun let out a shrill cry, his arms crossed together, the ritual implement on his wrist emitting a murderous aura, blocking the flying sword. The sharp blade of the sword and the ritual implement clashed, creating countless sparks. On the other side of the sparks, a figure could be faintly seen, pouncing over like a fierce tiger. Bai Qianjun fell to the ground. An extremely thick iron plate fell from the top of the hall, smashing heavily on the ground, sending up countless clouds of dust and making a loud noise. The iron plate had turned into an impassable iron door. A dozen highly skilled swordsmen of the Qin army had already arrived in front of Bai Qianjun, raising their iron shields, protecting him impenetrably. The two powerful layers of defense finally put Bai Qianjun at ease, his face showing an expression of anger and humiliation. Suddenly, his expression changed again because the assassin who had controlled the sword to kill had already arrived in front of the iron door. The iron door was over 2 inches thick, and even a siege crossbow could not penetrate it. Logically speaking, he should not be worried, but for some reason, he still felt uneasy and subconsciously took 2 steps back. A loud bang resounded. It was as if a thunderbolt that should have been high up in the sky had exploded in the hall, or as if 2 iron hammers weighing tens of thousands of pounds had collided head-on. Air billowed and spewed in the side hall, and smoke and dust rose. The highly skilled swordsmen of the Qin army with their iron shields were all knocked to the ground, blood spurting wildly. More than half of them had died. Bai Qianjun was protected very tightly, but he was still affected. Covered in blood, he was supported by the swordsmen of the Qin army who had once again arrived and retreated to the back. Dozens of highly skilled swordsmen of the Qin army had set up layer after layer of shield formations in front of him, and countless arrows were aimed at the smoke and dust. As the smoke and dust settled, the scene in the hall gradually became clearer. Only then did people realize that a large hole had been blasted through the iron gate. There was a person standing on the other side of the smoke and dust. His head was lowered, and he looked weak. His left sleeve had already been completely shredded, revealing a severely deformed iron arm. His messy hair danced in the wind, and a few strands of white hair could be vaguely seen. It was Zhuo Rizhui. He had killed the highly achieved swordsman of the royal court of the Qin kingdom with 1 sword strike, punched through an iron plate with 1 fist strike, killed a dozen swordsmen of the Qin army, and wounded the Qin emperor severely. Such combat prowess was indeed formidable. Of course, he had paid a great price for it. His chest was covered with blood stains, and he looked weak not because he was tired but because he was exhausted. More masters of the Qin kingdom rushed over. They directly tore down a corner of the side hall and erected countless iron shields, but no one dared to step forward. Bai Qianjun was helped up. He looked at Zhuo Rizhui through the shield formation and thought with a pale face that Zhuo Rizhui was indeed a little monster of the Aoyama sect. He was so powerful even in the dreamland. It took him less than 40 years to reach the state of free travel. It was well known that the free travel or the initial yuaning were the upper limit of the cultivation states in the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror. Even if you are powerful, so what? He said to Zhuo Ruzhui, "You will still die today." Zhuo Ruzhui lifted his head slowly and stared into his eyes, saying, "Don't talk nonsense. Let's fight one-on-one if you dare." Bai Qianjun said in a mocking tone, "This is a fight for the hegemony of the world. It's not a fight of bravery and ruthlessness. It's the behavior of a fool to try to fight against an entire state alone." Zhuo Ruzhui said, "You are the representative of the center state, but you have been forced by the disciples of the Aoyama sect to hide in a turtle shell for the rest of your life. Aren't you afraid of losing face?" Bai Qianjun sneered, "You are a fool, but do you think I am one as well?" No sooner had he said this than the arrows shot out like a rainstorm. Hundreds of highly achieved swordsmen of the Qin army leaped forward fearlessly, drowning Zhuo Ruzhui like the tide. The tide looked terrifying, but it was very difficult for it to swallow the reef in an instant. Zhuo Ruzhui was like a reef. The tide slapped on his body and turned into bloody bubbles. Occasionally, he would disappear, but he would reappear in the end. This bloody and cruel siege lasted for half a day. The hall was filled with corpses and broken crossbow arrows. The Qin kingdom paid the price of more than 100 highly achieved swordsmen, and Zhuo Ruzhui was finally unable to hold on. "It's not that I can't hold on, I'm just a little tired. I haven't slept well these days." Zhuo Ruzhui sat on the ground, coughing as he spoke. With every cough, some of the blood on his body would splash out, making him look very bloody. Bai Qianjun looked at him and said mockingly, "You really think of yourself as an assassin. Even if you still remember what happened outside, you still lost your way." Zhuo Ruzhui said, "What I did is not a big deal. But since you really think of yourself as an emperor, you are destined to have no future." Bai Qianjun said sternly, "The cultivation of the Aoyama sect only depends on the individual, but our Zhongzhou school is willing to lead the human race forward. This is the true leader. History will prove which is the true path, both here and in the outside world." Zhuo Ruzhui said, "If the green sky mirror hadn't limited the upper limit of the cultivation state, I would have killed you a long time ago. Are you going to lead the underworld forward?" Bai Qianjun sneered, "Do you think you can do whatever you want just because you have a higher cultivation state? Do you think you can command the swordsman? If we were in the outside world, I would be able to kill whoever I want after I reach the upper state of the heavenly arrival state. Otherwise, why didn't the leader of your Zhongzhou school go and kill Jian Shilai?" Zhuo Ruzhui spat out a mouthful of bloody saliva in front of him and asked tiredly, "Are you an idiot to ask such a question?" The expression on Bai Qianjun's face changed slightly, but he suppressed his anger and asked, "Tell me, where is Jing Jiao?" Zhuo Ruzhui felt even more baffled as he exclaimed, "Are you really an idiot to ask me this question?" Having said that, he slapped his palm down on his head and died. Then, he opened his eyes by the green sky mirror and woke up. It was dusk. The bright red rays of the setting sun shone on the slowly rotating green sky mirror, making the rivers look like blood. The gazes of a dozen participants in the Dao competition fell on him, showing a hint of awe and hatred. In that world, Zhuo Ruzhui had killed the most people, and his prowess was the most formidable, and he died the most valiantly. Zhuo Ruzhui didn't pay any attention to these gazes. He remained silent for a while looking at the bloody rivers and the red mountain in the green sky mirror, reflecting on something. He didn't express any of his feelings in the end, perhaps because he was reluctant to part with them, or regretful. He stood up and walked toward the outside of the cave while holding his waist, complaining incessantly. Chapter 400. The cultivation practitioners in the real world had all witnessed the bloody battle in the royal palace of Xianyang. They didn't miss any details, including the last conversation between Bai Qianjun and Zhuo Ruzhui. Seeing the corpses all over the ground and Zhuoruzhui sitting among them, it was quiet outside the Huin Valley for a long time. The cultivation practitioners pondered the conversation in silence, and the more they thought it made sense. The Zhongzhou school and the Aoyama sect were the leaders of the orthodox cultivation circle, but their styles of doing things were completely different. The Zhongzhou school focused on getting involved in the affairs of the human world. They tried to influence every corner of the human world through the imperial court, the officials, and the army, in an attempt to lead the human race forward. On the other hand, the Aoyama sect didn't care about the affairs of the human world. They wouldn't strike until it was necessary, like sending the disciples of Liang Wang Peek out to slay the demons and assassins. The disciples of the two sects acted according to this custom in the world of the green sky mirror. The so-called illusionary realm was not so different from the real world. Many people felt the significance of the illusionary realm, and they were even more curious about which side would win the Tao competition and obtain the precious fairy book of longevity. After Zhuoruzhui left the illusionary realm, Jingjiu was still in the illusionary realm. After the fire, the people in the illusionary realm were guessing whether Jingjiu was dead or alive, and the people in the real world knew that he was still alive. Jingjiu, who was sitting by the green sky mirror, hadn't woken up yet, the glass bell hanging behind him in silence. Yet, nobody knew where Jingjiu was. The blue bird hadn't found any trace of Jingjiu for a long time, which was truly shocking. The royal palace of the Chu kingdom had one more ruin and one less emperor. As such, the blue bird wouldn't stay here any longer. The Qin kingdom had entered a long period of steady development after the death of the assassin of the man in black. The merchants of the Qi kingdom had opened up a few new sea routes. Their enthusiasm for the alien land led to a great expansion of the ocean. Unfortunately, the cultivation practitioners were not interested in this kind of thing, and they were not interested in the debate in the academy of the Qi kingdom and Mr. Yinqi either. As such, Jingjiu stayed in the Zhao kingdom most of the time. Zhao's court situation seemed to be stable, but it was actually very unpredictable. Just as Bai Qianjun expected, Zhao's little emperor would eventually grow up, and the plot would naturally become interesting. In the past 5 years, the young son of heaven had become a young man and was gradually approaching adulthood. His performance was very outstanding. He was extremely filial and obedient to the Empress Dowager, and anyone could tell that it was from the bottom of his heart. There was absolutely no falsehood. He was also very respectful to Elder He and treated him as an elder. Perhaps it was because of these reasons that Elder He and the Empress Dowager gradually relaxed their restrictions on the young emperor. He had more and more opportunities to interact with the court officials and scholars. He even had a vague idea of forming his own team. Logically speaking, at least Elder He should have been vigilant against such movements, but for some reason, he didn't care about this at all. He led the Tiki and his subordinates to patrol the various states and counties all year round, or to be more accurate, to go on sightseeing tours. The rule that eunuchs were not allowed to leave the capital was completely meaningless to him. While enjoying the scenery, Eunuchy also did some things along the way. For example, supervising the irrigation works, dealing with the livelihood of the people, arranging military defense, punishing officials, bullying men and robbing treasures, making money wantonly. Although the people were not boiling with resentment, it was inevitable that there would be gossip. It was not until General Pei of the Chu kingdom died of illness, and the 7 groups of light cavalry of Zhao besieged the west camp, and won the battle that the whole world knew that Elder He had been planning for the past 5 years. Yes, the winner of this war was the Qin kingdom. The White Emperor obtained more than half of the territory of the Chu kingdom, but the most fertile eastern wilderness and the most important west camp fell into the hands of Zhao. When the news of the fire in the imperial palace of the Chu kingdom reached the west camp, He was in front of a map in the central military tent, discussing with the generals of Zhao how useful the old straight road in the western mountain would be if they were to invade Xianyang in the future. After hearing the news, he was silent for a while and then waved his hand to signal the generals to leave. Then he came to the room behind the tent. "Your emperor is dead," he said to the eunuch and the prostitute. The prostitute was somewhat at a loss and did not know what to say. The eunuch, on the other hand, burst into tears. He was a poor child who had a hard life and was often bullied in the imperial palace. If he had not shouted when someone wanted to burn down the imperial palace that year and won the trust of His Majesty, he would not have had the chance to live so many years of good life. It seems that your emperor liked you very much. Before he died, he wanted to find a way for you to live and sent you to me. Hejan looked at them and said, I wanted to kill you to disappoint him, but you are a gift after all, and I have never had the habit of refusing gifts. In all of Zhao, including the Qi kingdom, there were countless people who wanted to give gifts to Elder He, but only Jing Jiu dared to give him a gift by force. Accepting a gift did not mean that he would use it. For Hejan, it was not difficult to deal with it. He planned to ask his subordinates to send the eunuch and the prostitute to the Qi kingdom, and then ask the Shang of Qi to send them to the sea, where they could find a small island and live out their lives happily. What he didn't like was why Jing Jiu had never contacted him in the past, and why he didn't surrender to Zhao State, but to Qin State instead of Zhao State. What was the point of surrendering to Qin State? I'm not familiar with you, but Shima Peak and Guocheng Temple have a good relationship, which should be better than the relationship with Zhongzhou School, right? With such doubts, Hejan returned to the capital of Zhao. On the long street, the fleet of carriages was welcomed by the people, which was rare. The tiki beside the carriages had a strange look on their faces, wondering what was going on. Expanding the territory was undoubtedly the greatest achievement. No matter how much they hated him, they could only remain silent at this time. Hejan did not feel anything, nor did he care. The cheers outside the window were no different from the screams of the officials in the intelligence bureau to him. He was still thinking about that matter. As he walked into the imperial study, the young emperor came up to him and said sincerely, "Thank you for your hard work, uncle." Hejan suddenly said, "I have figured out." The emperor's expression changed slightly, but he forced himself to remain calm and said, "Uncle, what have you figured out?" Hejan ignored him and said, "So, it is because of the ill-fated princess." The emperor found it more and more strange, but it was not appropriate for him to ask further. Hejan collected his thoughts and came to the bookshelf in the imperial study. He pulled open the curtain and revealed the huge map behind it. Looking at the map, he was silent for a moment, and then he picked up his pen and marked a place in the Zhao territory. There were many such marks on the map, but there were still more blank spaces waiting in silence. It is said that I won the battle of the West military camp because I was far-sighted and didn't do anything. But nobody knew that this was the plan that the former emperor and I had drawn up 15 years ago. Hejan continued while looking at the young emperor. You should plan before you take any action. You should think it through before you do anything. The young emperor remained silent, as he thought that since it was the late emperor's effort, he was not qualified to lecture him. I don't know if the Chu emperor set himself on fire, or if he was killed by the imperial officials, or if he escaped with the help of the fire. Hejan came before the table and poured himself a cup of tea. He continued, regardless of whether he is dead or not, he is dead as far as the Chu people are concerned. He won't be able to cause any more trouble. The young emperor was startled upon hearing this, thinking that these words were a warning to him. He didn't dare remain silent any longer, saying, "I understand, uncle." It had been 37 years since the participants of the Tao competition had entered the world of the green sky mirror. Flowers couldn't bloom for 100 days, and people couldn't be happy for 1,000 days. Moreover, the relationship between the young emperor and elder he had never been good. The peaceful situation of the Zhao state didn't last long. As time went by, the emperor was getting closer and closer to adulthood, and he was about to take charge of the state. Naturally, many officials would express their loyalty in advance. The young emperor was getting more and more confident. He was still filial to the Empress Dowager and respectful to Hejan, but he would inevitably have some other ideas. A newly promoted Jinshi submitted a memorial to the imperial court, saying that the Zhao state governed the world with filial piety. As the emperor's father, King Hejian should be honored as the emperor, and his memorial tablet should be placed in the imperial ancestral temple. There was an uproar in the court, but none of the officials dared to express their opinions. The emperor remained silent, and the bead curtain remained motionless. Normally, this matter would cause a great disturbance, and the two sides would attack each other like a storm, but the court and the public remained strangely quiet. Everyone knew what the reason was. In the late autumn, the carriage of Elder he was stopped by a brave scholar. The scholar ignored the cold and gloomy eyes of the tiki and the worried eyes of the people around him, and shouted, "This is a great gift of the state. Please tell me, eunuch." No one thought that Elder he would answer this question, although everyone knew his opinion. Once this kind of question was answered, it was equal to opening the lid of the furnace, which could easily cause a big fire. The best way was to ignore it and pretend not to hear it. No one thought that everyone on the street heard his voice. King Hajian is a commandery prince. How could he be qualified to enter the imperial ancestral temple? The scholar was very surprised, and then his face showed a look of ecstasy, and he shouted repeatedly, "But he is the emperor's father." The voice of Elder he was still so calm. The emperor was adopted by the late emperor, so he has no father and son relationship with King Hajian. The scholar felt more and more that he would become famous today. His face turned red as if he had drunk a lot of wine, and he shouted, "Eunuch, you are an abnormal person, and you don't know the Tao of human relations. How can you be qualified to judge this matter?" The street became extremely quiet. Everyone thought that the scholar would die on the spot, or be arrested, and then be executed by 1,000 cuts. The tiki and the highly skilled eunuchs looked at the scholar as if they were looking at a dead man. Something unexpected happened again. Elder he didn't say anything. He ordered the carriage to move on, and he didn't pay attention to the scholar at all. Seeing the tiki leaving, the scholar couldn't stand it anymore, and his legs became weak. If he hadn't been surrounded by the crowd, he would have fallen to the ground. Hearing the praises coming from around and seeing the admiring expressions on people's faces, the scholar was very proud. He forced himself to calm down, and then he cupped his hands to salute and said some powerful words. A middle-aged scholar stood outside the crowd, shook his head at the scene, and left with a few people who looked like students. That day, they stayed in an academy. After finishing their homework, the students couldn't help but talk about what happened during the day. They all said that they were lucky to see such a scene when they just arrived in the capital of Zhao. The discussion turned into a discussion and eventually into a debate. The students argued more and more fiercely, and in the end, they could only look at the middle-aged scholar for help. The middle-aged scholar was elegant, and he looked calm. He was Mr. Yin Shi, who was highly respected by the world. The students wanted to know his answer, and the world also wanted to know. Chapter 4:01. Yin Shi said, "I support eunuchy." Hearing this answer, the students from the Academy of the Qi Kingdom were very surprised. What they wanted to ask was the teacher's judgment on Zhao's situation in the imperial court, not who he supported. In their opinion, the latter answer was yes. Hejian controlled the imperial court of Zhao and humiliated the emperor. Most importantly, he was a eunuch. His reputation was far worse than that of the ruthless white emperor. Who would support him? Although surprised, the students listened carefully because they believed that the teacher must have a reason. Last year, the Chu emperor had been praised by the teacher before he burned down the palace and died for his country. Who could understand at that time? King Hajian is a commandery prince. He is not qualified to enter the imperial ancestral temple. Yin Shi's explanation was exactly the same as what Hejian said on the long street today. A student said, "But he is Zhao Huang's biological father after all. It's normal for father and son to be unforgettable. The problem is that if the emperor insisted that King Hajian was his father, he shouldn't have come to the capital." Yin Shi said, "The previous Zhao Huang was generous and open-minded. How could he blame you just because he didn't want to be the emperor? It's just that the people of Hujin Manor didn't want to." After hearing this, the students thought carefully and found that it was indeed reasonable. No matter whether you regard the traitor as your father or the emperor as your father, as long as you do, you have to accept it. Yin Shi took a sip of tea and found that some students seemed to have thought of another explanation and were about to speak. He smiled and said, Of course, as people grow up, their views on everything may change, but you can also regret it. You can just abdicate and go back to Hajian Manor to be an idol lord. It's not a difficult life. The problem is that he still doesn't want to. The student's face revealed an understanding expression, and he didn't say anything else. Back then, it was Hajian Manor who didn't want to. Now it's the emperor himself who doesn't want to. He doesn't want to give up this and that. He wants to take advantage of both sides. Yin Qi said with a smile, "How could a figure like Eunuchy allow others to take advantage of him? We'll set off tomorrow." Since he would not allow it, Zhao would immediately welcome a bloody storm. The scholar did not have the strength to truss a chicken, so it was better for him to stay far away. The next morning, Yin Qi left the capital of the state of Zhao with his students, preparing to go to the Chu kingdom to see the palace that had been burned to ruins. Apart from the secret agents of the Intelligence Bureau, few people knew that the great scholar of the Qi Kingdom's education palace had been here before, let alone his comments. The conversation between Hejan and that scholar on a long street had spread throughout the whole capital as quickly as possible, and then to the more distant counties and states. When the scholar returned home and calmed down, he naturally felt some fear, but he believed in his political judgment and felt that there should be no problem. The more serious the matter was, the more cautious the bigwigs in the imperial court would be. With his thought and hope for a bright future, he drank a pot of good wine and passed out in a drunken stupor. Then he died just like that. Not long after the early morning, a few of his classmates heard about what had happened the day before and came to congratulate him with 2 old hens in their hands. As they pushed open the door and entered the small courtyard, they saw the ground covered in red and the corpse that had been so deformed that it was unrecognizable. Screams and screams broke the silence in the surroundings. Dozens of arresters, government runners, and coroners surrounded the small courtyard, but the scene inside was soon spread out. It was said that the scholar had died a very miserable death. It was obvious that he had been tortured to death. There was not a piece of undamaged skin on his body, and not a single bone was intact. It was unknown how much he had suffered when he was alive. The more tragic the death, the more likely it was to arouse the public's anger. Moreover, there were many forces behind the scenes who added fuel to the fire. Soon, the incident caused a great disturbance. The students of the Imperial College and many people surrounded the Intelligence Bureau angrily. The gloomy government office did not look so scary in the raging crowd. The angry people smashed the door of the Intelligence Bureau and rushed in, only to find that it was empty inside. There were no officials or eunuchs. All kinds of files and valuables had been moved away in advance. Even the gold-rimmed toilet bowl in the famous latrine was no longer in its original position. The government runners responsible for maintaining the security of the capital didn't dare to show up. The cavalrymen of the Imperial Army guarded the periphery. The soldiers of the City Gate Department stood further away, watching the bustle over there. They had no intention of taking action. The tide ebbed and flowed again. The crowd gradually dispersed, leaving only the Intelligence Bureau in a mess. Many officials in various mansions in the capital were discussing the incident and discussing something. Many officials thought that Elder He had handled the incident unwisely and that his response was too weak. He was like an old lion, not worth to be feared. However, Elder He had been in power for many years and had accumulated a great deal of power. Most of the officials didn't dare to act rashly. They wanted to wait and see how the situation would develop. It didn't take long for Hejan to make a move that night. The tiki galloped through the streets and alleys of the capital. The thunderous hoofbeats made people's hearts palpitate. Dozens of highly skilled eunuchs pushed open the doors of mansions one after another, with Hejan's handwritten letter in their hands. Under the commander of the Imperial Army, a total of 14 high-ranking officers were imprisoned and 7 officials of the City Gate Department were arrested. 2 of them were killed on the spot for resisting. The next morning, the governor of the capital resigned, the Imperial College was closed, and 79 students involved in the incident were arrested. The young emperor was nowhere to be seen at the court meeting, and there was no one behind the bead curtain. Elder He, who seldom attended court meetings, stood in the front of the hall from the shadows. He looked at the officials and calmly said, "I can understand if you want me to die, but before you kill me, I hope you will know your place." They had read the books of sages and eaten the food of the royal family. Not all of the officials could endure this kind of humiliation. They stood out on the spot to denounce the wrongdoings. Those officials were carried out of the palace by the guards to be publicly flogged. Not long after, one of them was beaten to death. The situation had become serious. All of the officials left the hall in anger. They came to the front of the royal palace and knelt down. Their cries shook the heavens as they talked about how the previous emperor was in the royal study. The young emperor looked at Ijan with a pale face. There was fear and even more hatred in his eyes. In a low voice, he said, "Crying in the palace will be recorded in the history books." Ijan's expression was indifferent. "Do you think I care?" His name would inevitably be recorded in the annals of history, and he would go down in infamy for thousands of years as a powerful eunuch. The young emperor forced himself to calm down and said, "Even if I did something wrong, those officials and students are innocent. Please have mercy." Ijan said, "It's very simple to release them. Your Majesty only needs to go out and say a word." As for what he wanted to say, everyone knew very well. The young emperor stared into his eyes and said, "That is my father." Ijan said, "I don't think so." The young emperor was so angry that he said in a trembling voice, "I am still an emperor. Why do you have to force me to this extent?" Ijan looked at him in silence and said nothing. But the young emperor understood what he meant. His body was slightly cold. He gritted his teeth and said, "Mother will not allow you to act recklessly." At this moment, a eunuch nervously said outside the royal study, "Eunuch, the Empress Dowager invites you." Hearing this, the young emperor finally relaxed. Ijan narrowed his eyes and looked at him. "It's quite easy to call her mother." Having said this, he turned and left the royal study for the Yuan Palace. The Empress Dowager had been in charge of the palace for many years. She still had her charm and majesty, so she treated Ijan differently. She advised him gently. It's hard for a child to miss his father. Even though it's not in line with the system and unreasonable, it's fine if you reprimanded him, but there's no need to make such a big fuss. In the matter of the scholar, it's too much. Ijan didn't explain the matter of the scholar. He said, "I told His Majesty years ago that the Hujin prefecture is a bunch of untamed bastards." Hearing the word His Majesty, the Empress Dowager's expression became cold. "I think this child is not bad. Don't act recklessly." She stared into Ijan's eyes, wanting some kind of guarantee. Ijan said, "I won't do anything, but those disobedient officials can't be kept. Please, Your Majesty, issue an edict to expel them from the court." The Empress Dowager was very angry. "Who in the court is willing to listen to you? Are you going to expel or kill them all?" The conversation ended in discord, and the matter reached an impasse, unless Ijan purged all the officials in the court. However, as the Empress Dowager was worried about, who would rule the country if all the officials were killed or expelled? It was at that moment that Yun Qi returned from the Chu kingdom. He revealed his identity and requested to see Elder He. As the leader of the education palace of the Qi kingdom, he had traveled around the world and given lectures for 20 years. He had an irreplaceable position in the hearts of the scholars and an unattainable reputation. Many people thought that the reason why a figure like Master Yun Qi requested to see the notorious eunuch, he must be because of the recent events. Ijan met Yun Qi in the intelligence bureau. The yamen was very clean, so the traces of the smashing that day were even more obvious. Ijan looked at Yun Qi and asked calmly, "Do you think it's all my fault?" Yun Qi said, "You were right in the beginning, but you were wrong in the end." Ijan said, "This is the place where I made my fortune, but it was smashed just like that." Yun Qi said, "If the eunuch didn't want this place to be smashed, who could have smashed it? Since Zhao is the eunuch's, you should cherish him more." Ijan sighed. "You really haven't become that kind of rotten scholar." Yun Qi looked at him in silence and asked, "Do you know me?" Ijan said with a smile, "I heard that you have forgotten everything, and it seems to be the case." Yun Qi stopped thinking about it and said with a carefree expression, "Since I don't remember those things, I can't say that I've forgotten them." He said, "What you said is reasonable. Anyway, thank you for coming." He was grateful to Shi for giving him a way out so that the whole thing could move on to the next stage as soon as possible. As for the students and officials of the Imperial College who had been released, they were even more grateful to Master Shi. After this incident, Master Shi's reputation grew even higher, as if he had become a mountain. Of course, He didn't care. Just when everyone thought that the matter would come to an end, that Elder He had finally revealed his weakness, and that the Imperial Party could take another step forward, the young Emperor had been poisoned. The poison was not very strong, not as strong as liquor, and not as sharp as a knife. The poison slowly circulated in his body, bringing no pain, only weakness and a sense of bewilderment. It was not until this moment that he realized that all his years of preparation had been meaningless. Those favors, those methods, and those eunuchs and guards who had been subdued were all fake. Just like his short few years as an emperor, it was like a strange black and white dream. Everything he had done was permitted by He, including torturing and killing that scholar. He sat on a round stool in front of the couch and said calmly to him, "I don't care how cruel your methods are, how insidious your thoughts are, and I don't care that you tormented and killed that scholar and framed me, because this is what I wanted to teach you. It's just that I don't want to see you sitting on the throne anymore." The young emperor showed a mocking expression in his eyes as he asked, "Did you want to see it before?" Chapter 402. Elder He could only have one emperor. The young emperor knew this very well. He said with endless resentment, "I'm an untamed wolf cub. What about you?" He tucked in the quilt for him without saying anything. The young emperor panted and said, "I've respected you for many years, just like a real uncle. But I still can't soften your heart. You never thought about letting me live to adulthood. Yes, just like those people outside the palace said, you'll kill me and get a new emperor. When he grows up, he'll die for some inexplicable, wonderful reason. Then you'll pick another young emperor. After all, there are many children in the royal family." He said, "It's troublesome to pick a child to be the emperor. It's not my wish." The young emperor seemed to have found strength from somewhere and shouted angrily, "But then you can be the emperor forever." He was silent for a while and said, "You're wrong. I want to kill you not because I want to be the emperor, but because you don't want to recognize your father." The young emperor lowered his voice and murmured, "But I'm not the former emperor's son. I haven't even seen him a few times." "You're not wrong, but he's my friend. If you don't want to be his son, he won't have any descendants." He said, "I have to pick another emperor who's willing to be his son for him." The young emperor suddenly chuckled, looking a bit crazy. He said, "Is it because you can't have children that you care so much about this?" He patted him on the shoulder and said, "Have a good rest." The young emperor died. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, not suffering any pain. There was no turmoil in the imperial court, and there wasn't even much discussion among the people. The Hejin prefecture showed signs of instability, but it was quickly suppressed. It wasn't until then that the officials in the imperial court and some people in the palace truly understood how powerful Elder He's control over the country was. Many people then remembered the rumors about Elder He. Elder He didn't drink wine, didn't ask for good food, didn't care about luxury, didn't play chess, didn't indulge in the beauty of the mountains, didn't covet the lake, and didn't have any hobbies. He woke up in the wee hours of the morning and went to bed very late. It was said that he only slept for 4 hours at most. So where did he spend his time? Only the trusted subordinates of the Intelligence Bureau knew how diligent Elder He was in practicing martial arts, how diligent he was in handling the state affairs, and how tirelessly he studied every day. The purpose of reading and learning was to improve one's realm and strength as soon as possible, and to strengthen one's ability to handle state affairs. As for those conspiracies and schemes, they were all in the category of figuring out and dealing with people. To the experienced Elder He, it didn't take much effort. After getting rid of the old, they had to welcome the new. It was impossible for the throne to be left empty. Appointing a new monarch was an urgent matter. Only two people were qualified to discuss this matter. In the quiet Yuan Palace, looking at Hejan, the Empress Dowager said with a pale face, "What exactly do you want to do? Become an emperor? Do you really want to seize the empire left behind by the late emperor?" She didn't have any children after marrying the late emperor. She had brought the young emperor to study in the palace and listen to state affairs in the imperial court, so it was inevitable that she had developed feelings for him. Hejan didn't answer her question, saying, "Pick a younger one, preferably one who hasn't yet remembered anything." The Empress Dowager snapped, "No matter who I pick, it's none of your business. Don't even think about moving a finger in this matter." Hejan asked calmly, "Why are you so vigilant against me?" The Empress Dowager stared into his eyes with strong hatred and said through gritted teeth, "You've already killed 2 emperors. Do you want to kill a third one?" Hearing this, Hejan was silent for a long time, then said, "So, in your heart, I've been the one who killed him all along. Isn't it true?" The Empress Dowager asked. Hejan said, "When the men in black tried to kill me, I was seriously injured and couldn't wake up, so I could only lie in your bedchamber. Why didn't you do anything at that time?" The Empress Dowager turned her head and looked out of the window, saying nothing. Hejan suddenly stepped forward and turned her face. He stared in her eyes and asked, "Are you afraid of me?" The Empress Dowager shouted angrily, "What are you going to do?" Hejan said expressionlessly, "Answer my question." The Empress Dowager sneered, "You're a eunuch. You killed the emperor, seized power, and interfered with the politics of the palace. Living in this palace, I'm in constant danger. How can I not be afraid of you?" Hejan shook his head and said, "No, the reason you're afraid of me is because you want to kill me." The Empress Dowager's body stiffened slightly. Hejan loosened his fingers and looked at the dark palace outside the window, saying, "You know that you've secretly subdued a few generals. I know that you've been in contact with Xianyang. I know that you've been arranging an escape route in the Qi Kingdom. I also know that when I was being treated in your palace, you personally boiled the medicine and put slow poison in it." The Empress Dowager's face grew even paler. Dripping water can pierce stone, and dripping poison can kill people, but that's too slow and too tiring. Hejan looked at the clouds illuminated by the starlight in the night sky and sighed, "Living like this is really tiring." A hopeless expression showed in the Empress Dowager's eyes as she said, "So you want me to die? You've thought too much. I promised the Emperor that I would protect you for the rest of your life. But it looks like it's unnecessary now." Hejan continued, "But I still want to tell you that the medicine I boiled for the Emperor back then wasn't poisoned." Having said that, he walked toward the outside of the Grand Hall. Looking at his back, the Empress Dowager suddenly had a complicated emotion, yelling, "What on earth do you want to do?" Hejan halted his steps, but he didn't turn around. "I don't know," he said. "I just feel a bit tired, as if I haven't had a good sleep for many years." Illuminated by the starlight, the clouds had a silvery border, and so did the surface of his black cloak. Guarded by dozens of highly achieved eunuchs, Hejan walked toward the outside of the royal palace. His boots stepped on the icy stone slabs, giving off a deep, thudding sound. It was exactly like his current mood. To see the reality in the illusory realm was the cultivation goal of every participant in the Tao competition. Yet, Hejan saw a different scene. What he saw was that even in the real world, there was still no reality. Everything was meaningless. He finally understood why Jing Jiao didn't hand over the Chu kingdom to him, and why the Empress Dowager asked him to go to the Guocheng Temple. It was because he would see all of this one day. It turns out that I'm a natural monk. In a quiet restaurant, Hejan was listening to the wind while holding a wine jar and mumbling to himself. A dozen wine jars were piled up under the table. The highly achieved eunuchs and the red-armored cavalrymen were everywhere inside and outside the restaurant, as well as in the nearby streets and alleys. Everybody sensed that the eunuch was in a bad mood that day. Otherwise, how could he drink so much when he was such a self-disciplined person? If elder, he was in a bad mood, Zhao would be in trouble, and the whole world would be in trouble. The royal army, the city gate department, and even the military headquarters had already made preparations. They could either seize the royal palace or send troops to the Qin kingdom. "Go and bring that person here," Jean suddenly said. A few subordinates eyed each other with a strange expression on their faces, wondering if that was it. Was the eunuch finally going to meet that person? What was so important about that person? There were many secrets in the Intelligence Bureau, as well as many strange things. What confused the officials the most was a cultivator named Jiang Rue. The Intelligence Bureau had a special department responsible for monitoring and controlling this person for many years, and it was said that the department had existed since the Intelligence Bureau was established. But the officials of the Intelligence Bureau thought that this person was extremely ordinary, and there was nothing to be wary of. It was better to just kill him than to spend so much money and effort on him. The cultivator, named Jiang Rue, was now a guest elder of a sect in Deer Mountain Commandery, which was not far from the capital city. With the ability of the Intelligence Bureau and decades of surveillance and preparation, they easily subdued him and brought him back to the capital city that very night. When Jiang Rue was brought to the restaurant and knelt on the ground, Jean was still drinking. But the wine jars under the table had increased to more than 30, piling up like a mountain. "You're here," Jean said to Jiang Rue. His tone was very indifferent, as if he were a friend who often met him. Jiang Rue had been quite successful in the past few years. Relying on his talent in cultivation and his ability to curry favor, he successfully became a guest elder of a sect. He was thinking about how he could go to the capital to look for opportunities when the sect leader suddenly turned hostile tonight. The disciples of the sect swarmed him and handed him over to a group of black-clothed men who escorted him to the capital. On the way there, he was shocked and uneasy. He thought of countless possibilities, but he couldn't find any clue as to what kind of powerful figure wanted to deal with him. Hearing the greeting, he mustered up the courage to raise his head and saw a completely unfamiliar face. After being stunned for a while, he asked humbly, "May I know your name?" "Your Excellency? Why are you looking for me, a man from the mountains?" He thought that this feminine middle-aged man in embroidered robes must be a big shot in the capital, since he could make the sect so obedient. But the man didn't kill him right away, so he must have some use for him, such as using him to assassinate his opponents in the imperial court. "It turns out that you've forgotten everything." Jean let out a wry smile. "Well, let me tell you a story." The story started many years ago in the real world. Two talented, free-traveling practitioners met outside a valley and ate a barbecued fish. Many years later, they entered the green sky mirror together and started asking questions. Jiang Rue had forgotten about the past a long time ago. He was shocked speechless after hearing the story. "Did you mean that we are not from this world?" he murmured. Jean said yes. "As far as the people in this world are concerned, we are the fairy men who have been banished to the mortal world." "I'm a fairy man?" Jiang Rue felt it was unbelievable. Thinking of the hardships he had to go through in this world, he felt sentimental, but he also felt ecstatic. He calmed down after taking a few deep breaths. "Who are you now?" he asked. Jean said, "I'm working in the royal palace. My family name is He. You might have heard of me." Jiang Rue was shocked again, even more so than before. It was because the reputation of elder, he was simply too famous. "You're eunuch He. How was it possible?" Right. "You said we are the fairy men, so we should be so powerful." "It's not right. Since we are partners, why didn't you come to me before?" The more Jiang Rue thought about it, the more confused he became. "Don't worry. You will remember everything slowly." Jean tossed away the alcohol jar in his hand and wiped his hands with a white towel, saying, "But I'm not sure if you are willing to remember those things." His foster mother was killed. She was sold by the human traffickers and beaten many times. She was castrated and brought to the royal palace. It was difficult for her to survive in the royal palace, and she had suffered a great deal. Jean had never forgotten those things, so Jiang Rue had to remember them as well. It didn't take long for Jiang Rue to recall those things, his face turning pale instantly. The most painful moment for those who were lost in the mortal world was not when they died in confusion, but when they woke up and faced the reality. "It turns out you are still alive, and you have entered the royal palace. It turns out that you are Elder He." Jiang Rui intended to explain what had happened back then. He moved his lips, but couldn't utter a word. Chapter 403. Jiang Rui could no longer kneel properly and fell to the ground. Nobody would be happy to die as soon as he found out the truth. With a confused expression, he murmured to himself, "I don't want to die. I don't like it no matter how I die." Jiang said, "I have been thinking about how to kill you all these years and have designed more than a dozen ways for you to die. In order not to let you die prematurely because of an accident, I sent many people to protect you. Zhuizhui wanted to kill you, but I risked my life to save him. Now that I have come this far, you have to choose one of them." Jiang Rui felt cold both physically and mentally. "Even if you want to play with me, you have played with me for so many years. Why didn't you kill me earlier? Why did you wait until today? You're my anchor point in the illusionary realm. As long as you are alive and my hatred is still there, I will never forget that real world." Jiang said, "Until just now, I suddenly realized that these things are meaningless, so I don't have to keep you alive anymore." Jiang Rui murmured, "I am talented and have all kinds of willpower and means, but it has always been so difficult for me to move forward. It turns out that you have been suppressing me in secret. You have always thought that I am useless outside and that I am just lucky. Do you think that I am just lucky here and have gotten ahead of you? You have to understand and accept the fact that you are never as good as me. If you can do it, you can do it. If you can't, you can't. You can't do it outside, and you can't do it here. Ha ha. I just realized that you are a eunuch. How does it feel to have your penis cut off? I don't care if I can do it or not, but you can't." Jiang Rui said contemptuously. Suddenly, a trace of fierceness flashed in his eyes. He didn't intend to sneakily attack Jiang, but he wanted to commit suicide. Unfortunately, he failed. Jiang's clothes moved slightly, leaving several residual shadows. It seemed that he didn't move, but in fact, he had sealed all of Jiang Rui's meridians and sat back in a chair. Jiang Rui's expression changed abruptly. "Sorry, I didn't mean that. Back then, I didn't expect you to suffer so much." Jiang didn't pay attention to him and explained calmly, "The method I use will make you unable to move, so you can feel it more clearly and make sure that you won't pass out. What kind of pain would it be to bear the horrible punishments of the Intelligence Bureau in such a state?" Jiang Rui said with a pale face, "Do you really have to do it? I admit defeat. I admit my mistake. Just give me a quick death." Jiang said nothing. Jiang Rui had completely lost all hope. He panted heavily and said, "I've admitted to everything. But according to the rules of the Tao competition, what happened inside can't be brought outside. You can't hate me." He didn't want to endure the dreadful pain, and he was even more unwilling to be suppressed by Jiang after he left the illusionary realm. Jiang said with a faint smile, "How could it be? So, no matter how painful you are later, don't hold a grudge against me. Outside, we are still friends." Jiang Rui had already prepared himself mentally, thinking that given his talent and cultivation, as long as he could maintain his Tao heart, no matter how severe the punishment was, he suddenly felt a chill when he saw the faint smile on Jiang's face. "What do you intend to do with me?" he asked hoarsely. Jiang said, "Death by dismemberment." "Sorry, I know it's not a creative idea." Jiang Rui's face turned paler, and his body trembled. He wanted to throw himself at Ning Ke and beg for mercy, but he couldn't move. "The scene is too bloody. I won't watch it. Enjoy yourself." Jiang left the tavern after saying that. As he walked out of the tavern, he glanced at the eaves of the opposite house. The blue bird had flown away. He believed that the cultivation practitioners outside the Huin Valley didn't want to see the cruel scene, either because they were not deviant swordsmen, at least on the surface. The street was quiet at night. The morning light could be seen in the distance, but the human world was even darker. Jiang walked toward the darkness in a black cloak. Suddenly, he heard a scream behind him. The scream didn't stop, but it was getting weaker. Jiang Rui was a cultivation practitioner with a good state, but his death was a trivial matter in such a vast world. Only the sect in Lushan County had been nervous for a long time because of this matter. The sect leader even thought about going to the capital city to beg for forgiveness from Elder He. But as time went by, the Intelligence Bureau didn't give him any more orders, and he gradually felt relieved. Nobody knew what it meant that He-Jean had kept this person here for several decades, but he was suddenly captured and executed that night by dismembering his body. The Empress Dowager didn't know what happened in the tavern that night. She waited anxiously for He-Jean's reaction. In her view, a disloyal villain like He-Jean would definitely take advantage of the conflict in the palace that night to do something. Unexpectedly, He-Jean didn't do anything. He didn't even pay attention to the selection of a new emperor. He just handled the state affairs as usual. Soon, Zhao State welcomed a new emperor. The emperor was held by the Empress Dowager and sat on a chair behind the beaded curtain. From that day on, He-Jean didn't attend any more court meetings. Only his closest subordinates could find something unusual about Elder He. Recently, he often stared at a certain spot in the gray sky, and his mind would wander for half a day. Sometimes he would go to a remote, cold palace and walk back and forth in those narrow alleys. Sometimes he would walk into a small courtyard that had long been deserted, take out a bamboo chair and lie down, waving a round fan in his hand. It was the beginning of autumn now. From autumn to winter and then to spring, time passed slowly and uninterestedly. He-Jean was tired of it, but he suddenly found a familiar feeling. There were many things that he was gradually forgetting, but many things were resurfacing from the bottom of his heart. He felt that he had lived a similar life somewhere, like in a temple. Then, he suddenly wanted to eat a plate of stir-fried red moss. The chestnut tree on the slope of the imperial garden had long grown up. The scar left by the broken branch had become harder and clearer. He often stood under the chestnut tree and subconsciously touched the scar with his right hand, looking into the distance. No one knew what he was thinking. One day, he suddenly remembered the sea and the ship on the sea. There was a friend on the ship and an old man with silver hair. The old man with silver hair seemed to have said something before he passed away. But the sound of the waves was too loud, and he was too sad and angry, so he didn't hear it clearly. What was the meaning of the old man's words? He-Jean thought for a long time, and one day, he finally remembered it. The small boat disappeared. Elder He suddenly disappeared. The Intelligence Bureau was emptied again, and the gold-rimmed toilet bowl was gone. Many officials and secret agents of the Intelligence Bureau, as well as the commanders and soldiers of the Red Cavalry, disappeared at the same time. No one knew where they went, and there was no trace of them in the provinces and counties. This incident shocked the whole of Zhao State, and then the whole world. In the urgently convened Imperial Court Conference, none of the civil and military officials could say anything. This matter was too bizarre and unreasonable. Some officials even wondered if the Intelligence Bureau had incurred the wrath of the heavens and the people, so they were punished by the heavens. What the hell is going on? So many people have disappeared at the same time, but you can't find anything. The Empress Dowager lifted the beaded curtain angrily and stood in front of the officials, scolding, "Do you think I'm counting on you good-for-nothings to govern the country?" The disappearance of He-Jean should have made her feel relieved and delighted, but for some reason, she felt both shocked and angry at the same time. Especially late at night, when she thought of He-Jean's departure, she felt even more lonely. A few days later, they finally found some clues. The Grand Secretary of the Imperial Court entered the palace that very night and knelt before the bed of the Yuan Palace, reporting to the Empress Dowager in a low voice. The whole of Zhao State knew that there was a group of ferocious water bandits in the deep end of the vast Ping Lake. Even though the navy of the Imperial Court had tried many times to exterminate them, they couldn't hurt them. On the contrary, many ships were sent to them. Not long after He-Jean disappeared with the officials of the Intelligence Bureau, the group of water bandits suddenly left the Ping Lake. Over 100 large ships sailed into the Qi Kingdom via the waterways, and then headed straight for the East Ocean, disappearing without a trace. Come to think of it, He-Jean and his subordinates should have been on that fleet at the time. It sounded simple, but it was not. He-Jean had not only concealed the truth from the Imperial Court and the public for many years, But he had also made use of the waterway system that Zhao State and the Qi Kingdom had spent many years repairing. Moreover, those large ships were obviously built with the technology of the Qi Kingdom. To accomplish this, Hejan had planned for many years and put in a great deal of effort. The Empress Dowager's face turned pale instantly. She turned around and looked at the sleeping child on the bed, remaining silent for a long time. "Did you always want to leave? Or was it just a backup plan that you prepared that night because you were too disappointed in me?" The chief eunuch who had dominated the imperial court for decades was gone. For the people of Zhao State, it was like the imperial palace in the capital had suddenly disappeared. Everyone felt a strong sense of panic, and the imperial court and the public fell into a dead silence. The rumor gradually spread. After confirming that Elder He had indeed left, instead of standing in the shadows and watching the world, as he had done in the past, the whole country fell into a state of confusion and emptiness. Countless petitions and petitions from the people were sent to the imperial palace like snowflakes, asking the imperial court to send an army to search for Elder He as soon as possible. As time went by, those petitions and petitions became fewer and fewer until there was nothing left. It was not until midsummer that everyone realized that Elder He might not come back, and the situation changed again. Countless petitions and petitions from the people were sent to the imperial palace like snowflakes again, but the content was completely different this time. From the officials to the people, everyone accused Elder He of using his power shamelessly and being cold-blooded. They said that the reason why he left was that he colluded with the Qin Kingdom and knew that treason was unforgivable, so he fled to avoid punishment. All the officials in the imperial court had given money to Elder He and tried to please him. Then who was Elder He's lackey? In order to find out who was the real lackey and who barked louder, the officials in the imperial court began to attack each other fiercely. It was chaotic and ugly for a while. It was not until the early winter that the situation finally stabilized. In the process of stabilizing the imperial court, the Empress Dowager showed excellent political wisdom and means. Then it was the discussion of crimes. The imperial court convicted Hejan of 74 major crimes. In addition to the most common crimes, there were also some strange crimes that even the Intelligence Bureau couldn't think of. Looking at those crimes, the Empress Dowager looked more and more terrible. Finally, she couldn't control her emotions anymore. She slammed the desk heavily and broke the red brush pen in her hand. The red spots fell on the wall, looking like beautiful red plum blossoms. What kind of nonsense is this? In the end, the Empress Dowager only approved a few crimes. The main ones were carelessness, rudeness, and dishonesty. But no matter how many crimes she approved, Hejan was destined to go down in history. Of course, it was a bad reputation. Thinking of this, she felt a little sorry. She came to the imperial garden, waved her hand to dismiss the palace maids with umbrellas, and walked to the chestnut tree. This was the place where they used to stand. Snow fell on her body. Chapter 404. Hearing this news, all the soldiers and civilians of the Qin Kingdom were overjoyed. On the path of conquering the world and unifying the world, the only person they had to worry about was Zhao State, or more precisely, Eunuch He. Yet, the Qin Emperor didn't believe this news at all, thinking that it must be a conspiracy. Eunuch He had a strong foundation in Zhao State, and his methods were not inferior to the Qin Emperor's. He had just appointed a child as the new emperor, and he was in his prime. How could he suddenly abandon everything and disappear? Countless secret agents and highly achieved swordsmen were sent out to Xianyang City, looking for Eunuch He everywhere in the world, but to no avail. Besides the Qin Emperor, many other forces tried to find the whereabouts of Eunuch He, or to take over his political and military legacy in the world, or at least to ascertain whether he was dead or alive, but they didn't find any clues. Eunuch He had disappeared, just like Jingjiao. Even though the great man had left, the sun would still rise. Time elapsed, and a few years had passed. It had been 42 years since the Dao competition began. Under the rule of the royal dowager, Zhao State didn't have any trouble, but it couldn't be as powerful as before. It had lost its edge, and it couldn't compete with the Qin kingdom anymore. After absorbing the strength of the Chu kingdom, the Qin kingdom became even more powerful, and its cavalry was invincible. One early morning, as the morning sun rose, the Qin emperor got up and walked to the window. He frowned slightly as he smelled the burning paint coming from outside the palace. In order to prepare for the upcoming war, the Qin kingdom had been stockpiling weapons and armors. The smell and the smoke were unavoidable. The Qin emperor had gotten used to the smell a long time ago, and he even enjoyed it. But his coughing had gotten worse recently, casting a shadow over his mind. He was a cultivation practitioner, so he knew that he was not sick, but for some reason, he still felt uncomfortable. The empress walked over with a bowl of white fungus soup in her hands and 3 pieces of autumn pear paste candy on the side of the plate. "Your Majesty, should we ask the royal doctor to come and have a look?" she asked gingerly. The Qin emperor furrowed his eyebrows even more. He shot her a look of disgust, saying, "You are just a woman who knows nothing. Why do you have so much to say?" Having said that, he turned around and left. The empress stood on the same spot with a pale face, and came to her senses after a while. She put down the plate hastily and saw him off on her knees. She knew that His Majesty was going to Shu Palace to see the princess. Whenever something big was about to happen, His Majesty would go there. Even if there was nothing big, His Majesty preferred to drink tea there. His Majesty and the princess met more times than she did, but she didn't dare to complain because she knew that the princess's position in His Majesty's heart was many times higher than hers. The Shu Palace was as quiet and secluded as it had been in the past. The remnant lotus in the pool did not give off the feeling of dilapidation. Perhaps it was because the lanterns hanging in the corridor still had the smell of last night's incense and candles. The Qin emperor took off the overcoat and tossed it to a palace servant girl. He sat on the opposite side of the zither platform and took a deep breath, feeling much calmer now. Bai Zhao sat on the other side of the zither, his fingers lightly pressing on the zither strings. His black hair was casually tied behind him, as natural and beautiful as the white satin hanging between his arms. The eunuch he must have gone out to sea, and he won't be back in a short time. Even if the Chu emperor is still alive, he won't dare show up. And like what you said back then, one person can't cause any trouble. The Qin emperor picked up the teacup and took a sip and continued, "I want to push the situation forward." Bai Zhao lifted up his head and said to him, "You seem to be in a hurry today." His tone made the Qin emperor feel uncomfortable. After coughing twice, he said, "We have to do what we have to do. It's better to get it done as soon as possible." Bai Zhao lowered his head and looked at the zither strings under his fingers, asking, "What about the Qi kingdom?" Yin Qi's reputation is too high right now. He has many followers in Qi, Zhao, the old Chu, and even in my Xianyang city, but he insists on not having a war. The Qin emperor put down the teacup and said with a cold expression in his eyes, "This emperor intends to unify the world. He and his doctrine will bring me a lot of trouble." Bai Zhao didn't lift up his head as he asked, "What are you going to do? We can't kill this kind of person easily. Otherwise, the populace will be divided, and it will be more troublesome to conquer the world." The Qin emperor said, "This emperor wants to see if I can persuade him. It's hard to persuade the scholars of Yamatsai, because they are very clear about their own doctrine." Bai Zhao continued while stroking the zither strings. "Though Shi Yun has forgotten his origin, it's still the case." The Qin emperor said, "This emperor will tell him with the hard facts that if he wants to resist this emperor's armored cavalry, he will bring more disasters and sufferings to the populace in the world. It's better for him to surrender directly." Bai Zhao said, "If you want to persuade him in this way, do you think he will be willing to come to Xianyang?" Though the Qin emperor had a powerful martial art prowess, he had never left the royal palace of Xianyang, especially after the assassination attempt by the men in black. This emperor will inform the whole world to ensure his safety. "If Yin Qi still doesn't dare come under the circumstances, it's fine," said the Qin emperor. Bai Zhao lifted up his head and stared at his eyes in silence for a long time. "That's fine," he said. In the late autumn, The famous scholar master Yun Qi of the Qi Kingdom came to Xianyang City with more than 100 disciples. The city gate of Xianyang City was open wide. Countless populace came to watch this rare event in the land. Even many famous scholars of Zhao State and the Old Chu State came. Master Yun Qi and his disciples wore the long robes with wide sleeves and long swords, looking extraordinary. They attracted a great deal of attention as they walked on the street. The populace of the Qin Kingdom stood on both sides of the street, looking at these rumored scholars curiously. Some of them didn't understand, thinking that it was difficult to pull out such a long sword. So what was the use of such a sword on the battlefield? Someone explained that the long swords of Master Yun Qi and his disciples were a kind of ornament, used to express their attitude, rather than to be used in combat. The populace who asked the questions nodded their heads, thinking that the scholars of the Academy of the Qi Kingdom were indeed meticulous in their conduct. But they still felt that the swords were a bit of a burden. More than 100 disciples were invited into the Academy of Xianyang City to talk with the imperial academicians of the Qin Kingdom and the famous scholars of Zhao State and the Old Chu State. The conversation naturally turned into a debate, which was very exciting. However, the celebrities from Zhao and the Old Chu were actually paying more attention to another place. Countless gazes were fixed on the cluster of black palaces. All the knowledgeable scholars of the land were waiting nervously to see if Master Yun Qi could persuade the Qin Emperor to give up his ambition of unifying the land. If Master Yun Qi failed, this land would be plunged into blood and fire in a few years' time. The royal palace of Xianyang and the Academy of the Qi Kingdom were the two most magnificent palace buildings in the world. Yun Qi had lived and taught in the Academy of the Qi Kingdom for dozens of years, so he was used to the magnificent buildings, but he still felt a bit pressured walking in the royal palace of Xianyang. Those black palaces were like countless reefs, standing silently in the raging sea, giving off an unshakable feeling of power. Yun Qi wasn't sure if he could persuade the Qin Emperor. In fact, he didn't have any hope for this trip. As he walked into the Grand Hall, he narrowed his eyes to get used to the changes in the brightness, and then he saw the Qin Emperor sitting in the deepest and highest part of the hall. Back then, the Qin Emperor liked to wear the armor made of mithril, which looked like the snow, and he called himself the White Emperor. But he didn't like the white armor as much as he did at some point. He wore an ordinary black robe that day, sitting casually on the throne, as if he had become one with the surrounding grand hall. "Mister, please sit down." The Qin Emperor reached out his right hand to greet him from a distance. Yun Qi sat down on the empty ground in the grand hall. Glancing at the cup of green tea on the table, he said, "The way the emperor treats his guests is indeed unique." What he meant was not the cup of green tea, nor the simple and honest customs of the Qin Kingdom, but the distance. The place the Qin Emperor sat was 300 feet away from his current position. No matter how formidable an assassin was or how powerful an arrow was, it was impossible for him to strike a fatal blow from such a long distance. Mister is a smart man. This emperor likes to be straightforward. The time it takes to drink a cup of tea should be enough. The Qin Emperor didn't respond to Yun Qi's words. Yun Qi looked at him in silence and said, "Please speak your mind, Your Majesty." The Qin Emperor said, "What this emperor wants is the land and the people, and what you want is the hearts of the people. Both of them are conquering each other, but the essence is the same. If you are willing to cooperate with this emperor, it will be easier for you to carry out your Tao." This suggestion seemed simple, but it was actually quite formidable. There were countless details hidden in it, and the details were all devils, and the devils were good at enticing people. If Yijan were in Yun Qi's position, he might even agree to the Qin Emperor's suggestion. Yet, Yun Qi didn't accept it, saying, "It's a pity that the Tao I seek can be found anywhere in the world, but not in Qin State." The Qin Emperor leaned forward slightly and looked at Yun Qi in the distance. "Why?" he asked in a cold voice. Yun Qi said, "It's because Your Majesty wants to rule the world by force, and I want to rule the world by force." The Qin Emperor said, "If this emperor wants to rule the world, I have to rule the world by force. After I rule the world, I will rule the world by force." Yun Qi asked, How can your majesty persuade me? The Qin emperor said, "This is not the education palace of the Qi kingdom, and this emperor is not your student. Do you want to test this emperor?" Yun Qi said calmly, "I just want to discuss it with your majesty." Having said that, he took out a scroll from his sleeve and put it on the table. A eunuch took the scroll and checked it carefully. After making sure that it was not poisoned and had no hidden traps, the eunuch handed it to the Qin emperor. The Qin emperor opened the scroll and skimmed through it a few times, saying in a mocking tone, "These are all boring topics for the older students to talk about." Yun Qi said, "If your majesty wants to be the ruler of the world, you have to understand what you have to bear." Ruling the world was never a simple task, but one had to be careful not to stir the oil in the pot carelessly. It was important for every person in the world to know how a ruler would determine his position in history and what he would pursue in the mortal world. After a moment of silence, the Qin emperor said, "This emperor can't solve these problems." Yun Qi sighed and said, "Let's call it a day then." There was no need to talk about the unification of the world, and there would be no more wars. The populace would live and work in peace and contentment. The world would be at peace. There was no need to say that there was no righteous war in troubled times, and that ordinary people shouldered the world. Each of them had their own reasons. Those who walk different paths cannot make plans together. The world would never have imagined that the negotiations that had attracted the attention of the world would end so quickly. The Qin emperor suddenly said, "It's true that this emperor can't solve the problems raised by my teacher, but this emperor can deal with the person who raised the problems." Hearing this, Yun Qi smiled and stood up, saying, "So the reason your majesty invited me to Xianying is to kill me." The Qin emperor laughed aloud and said, "Mister, you misunderstood me. This emperor wants to give you a chance to kill me." Yun Qi remained silent for a long time before asking, "Why does your majesty know me so well?" The Qin emperor stopped smiling as he said, "It's because this emperor knows better than you who you are. You are a bunch of stubborn people who only believe in your own principles. Today is your only chance to come before me. You can either convince me or kill me. If you miss this chance, you will never forgive yourself." Yun Qi didn't say anything else. His right hand slowly grasped the hilt of his sword. A sword as an accessory could also be used to kill. After a long period of silence, the hall was deathly still. It was like a graveyard, but no one knew who would be lying here. A faint smell of burning paint blew in from outside the hall, tousling the rims of Yun Qi's cloth. Yun Qi leapt up, drifting forward like a patch of cloud. His long sword had already come out from the sheath and was grasped in his hand. The Qin emperor looked at the scene expressionlessly while standing 300 feet away. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. The sounds of countless crossbow strings being pulled rang out. Countless crossbow bolts fell down like a rainstorm, occupying all the space in the grand hall. The sharp arrowheads could cut through his cloth easily, but they couldn't pierce into his body. In the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror, Jing Jiu's speed was the fastest, and He Zhan's movement was the most unpredictable. As such, Yun Qi's movement was the most unpredictable, like a feather that couldn't withstand any force or a real cloud. However, the crossbow bolts in the grand hall were too dense. By the time Yun Qi arrived 100 feet away from the Qin emperor, his body had already been pierced by a dozen crossbow bolts, blood gushing out. The Qin emperor was still expressionless. He slapped the armrest of the throne chair with his right hand, ready to leave through the underground tunnel. Back when the iron plate in the grand hall was pierced through by Zhu Ruzhui with one punch, he had to change his last means of self-preservation. The underground tunnel was built with green rocks a few feet thick. As long as he could enter it, no assassin would be able to hurt him. It was then that he suddenly sensed a subtle change in the energy in the grand hall. It was a faint burning smell. He was certain that it was not the smell of the burning paint outside the palace. The expression on his face changed slightly. He saw a tiny spark coming out from the scroll through the corner of his eye. The 7 questions raised by Yun Qi were written in the scroll. The spark spread out at an unimaginably fast speed, turning into a flame and a dreadful explosion in the end. Boom! The throne chair was blown to pieces, and the mechanism at the entrance of the underground tunnel was destroyed. The Qin Emperor was knocked back a few feet, his black robe in tatters. He was wounded severely. Yun Qi landed in front of him and thrust his sword forward. Pa! Pa! Countless sounds of air waves colliding with each other occurred, and the smoke and dust danced chaotically, blocking the view in the grand hall. The Qin Emperor's face and body were full of cuts, looking like a broken wineskin, bleeding incessantly. Yin Qi couldn't stand anymore and fell to the ground. The arrows the Qin Emperor used to deal with Jingjiao were all specially made. They were dipped in poison and mixed with secret silver, and their sharpness was enough to pierce through the armor. Even a cultivation swordsman couldn't withstand them. Dozens of swordsmen of the Qin army swarmed into the grand hall. Some of them stood in front of the Qin Emperor, and some of them charged toward Yin Qi, ready to cut him into pieces. "Stop!" the Qin Emperor shouted sternly. He was enraged to the extreme. He pushed away the experts of the Qin army and came before Yun Qi like a ferocious tiger ready to devour someone. Yun Qi ignored him and kept coughing blood with his head lowered. Seeing this, the Qin Emperor suddenly calmed down. He waved his hand tiredly to signal for everybody to leave. Yun Qi's chest was pierced through by a dozen crossbow bolts, and he had a head-on collision with the Qin Emperor. He couldn't even stand up, to say nothing of fighting back. Of course, the warriors of Qin army were worried, but none of them dared to defy the decree of His Majesty. Slowly, they retreated out of the hall. The hall became deathly silent once more, as if it was a real graveyard. The Qin Emperor stared into Yun Qi's eyes and asked, "What is in that scroll?" Yun Qi said, "It's a talisman." The Qin Emperor exclaimed in surprise, "Didn't you forget everything? Why do you still know how to write the talismans?" Yun Qi was taken aback, and then he suddenly laughed out, saying, "It turns out that I have known how to do it before." Chapter 4:05. There were no amulets in the world of the Green Sky Mirror. If Yun Qi hadn't come here, the amulet wouldn't have appeared even after tens of thousands of years. He had forgotten all the past events, including what he had learned in Yamatai. However, he had created the amulet himself in the process of reading and cultivation. The so-called path could lead to the same destination by different means, or it could lead to all the phenomena in the mirror. It was truly marvelous. In the real world, Yin Qi was the founder of a sect. Even if he couldn't ascend and become a ferryman, he would at least become a saint. Of course, he might have been influenced by his Tao heart from his previous life, so he could create the amulet here, but it was still an astounding achievement. Looking at the scholar lying in the pool of blood, the Qin Emperor suddenly felt that it would be meaningless even if he became the ruler of the world. This idea was rather inappropriate for a cultivation practitioner. He came back to his senses soon after and said in a low voice, "So what? This emperor is still alive." Yun Qi raised the broken sword and pointed it at him, saying, "You should have died. If a person would die when he was supposed to die, the world would be much simpler. Unfortunately, the world has never been like this." The Qin Emperor continued nonchalantly, "You have indeed almost killed me, just like what Zhuoruzhui did back then. You people have a high talent and powerful methods, but you are too stupid to understand that the anger of an ordinary man is meaningless to the world." Yun Qi said, "Maybe you are right, Your Majesty, but it's too boring to live such a smart and wretched life." The Qin Emperor stared into his eyes and said, "Interesting, because you attempted to assassinate this emperor. Your disciples and your followers will all be killed by this emperor. Isn't it more interesting?" Yun Qi stared into his eyes in silence for a long time, and suddenly spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. Seeing this, the Qin Emperor showed a cruel and delighted smile in his eyes. Yun Qi said while coughing up blood, "I don't understand why you have done this. You can't kill all the people in the world. Even though you can dominate the world with your cruel rule, it won't last long. Shouldn't an emperor strive for 1,000 generations? You are fully aware that the tyrannical Qin dynasty will be destroyed in a second life if you continue like this. Why don't you turn back? So you really think that I don't dare to kill you, just like those useless scholars and women in the world? The Qin emperor looked at him and said in a mocking tone, I've forgotten something, but you've forgotten it even more thoroughly. That's why you have chosen this path of death. Yin Shi remembered the conversation he had with the Grand Secretary Zhang of the Chu Kingdom many years ago and the conversation he had with Yuniki. He said calmly, You always say that I have forgotten many things. I'm not sure what they are, but I don't care. Even if it is true, I can reach the other side without any burden. It may seem ignorant, but it is also easier. The Qin emperor said, Ignorance is ignorance. If you knew that what this emperor sought was not the inheritance of all ages, but the fairy book, you would understand everything. Yin Shi said, The fairy book, it seems a bit familiar. Seeing his reaction, the Qin emperor got angry for some reason, yelling, That is the most precious treasure of the fairy world that we cultivation practitioners dream of, and it is a slim chance of achieving longevity. I see. Yin Shi lowered his head and looked at the blood on his body. He threw away the broken sword and wiped his face with his sleeve, saying, Thanks to your reminder, I have indeed remembered something. The Qin emperor's eyes brightened slightly, and he asked with an inexplicable expectation, What have you remembered? I thought you would die today because I thought the Chu emperor would appear in Xianyang. I vaguely felt that this would change many things. Yin Shi continued, Now that I have remembered that he has a name, Jingjiu. He is a formidable figure. After a moment of silence, the Qin emperor said, Since you have remembered those things, it means you are going to die. Yes, I have remembered some things. Yin Shi paused and continued, I have remembered some more. The Qin emperor looked at him with a seeming smile. I have remembered many things. No, I have remembered everything. Looking at the top of the hall, Shi Yun said, I am indeed not a person of this world. It was a simple statement, but it contained countless emotions. It was as calm as the water. The Qin emperor looked at him and said scornfully, Do you feel it is very empty? You are a disciple of Yamatsai, but you have lost yourself in a mortal world. It is really ridiculous. Shi Yun shook his head and said, I am me in that world, and I am still me in this world. Then he said seriously, I'm the same person wherever I am. It doesn't matter whether I remember it or not. How can I be lost? The Qin emperor fell silent again. But you will die in the end, he said wearily. I will win this Tao competition, and the fairy book will belong to me. Shi Yun pulled back his gaze and asked the Qin emperor, Is this the only meaning of this Tao competition for you? For some reason, the Qin emperor got angry again. Meaning? After you die, I will kill all of your disciples and followers, burn all of your books, and forbid anyone from spreading your theories. No one will even be allowed to mention your name. I will erase all traces of you in this world. By then, what will be the meaning of this world? What will be the meaning of this world to you? Shi Yun said calmly, The principles are something beyond cognition. Learning is not an invention, but a discovery. Even if I die and my books are burned, the principles will still be found by others. As for the meaning of this world to me, it will remain in my cognition, and my meaning to this world will remain in my cognition. This is enough. The expression in the Qin emperor's eyes grew even colder, as he said, You are a man of righteousness and righteousness. Don't you feel ashamed that your disciples will be killed by this emperor? The deer are crying in the wild. Their cries are not sorrowful, but angry. It's because they are not responsible for the situation they are facing. Shi Yun said seriously while staring at his eyes, In my opinion, you don't have to do this. On the beam on the roof of the grand hall, the blue bird stood there in silence, looking at the scene below. The cultivation practitioners in the real world were also looking at the scene. The arrows were piled up like a small hill. Shi Yun sat in a pool of blood. The Qin emperor stood in front of him, and suddenly laughed out loud. The laughter echoed in the gloomy and bloody palace hall. It was very cruel. This cruelty was to this world, and also to himself. If it were before, you might be able to threaten me, but I've forgotten some things that I want to forget, so you can't do it. Having said this, the Qin Emperor turned around and walked toward the outside of the Grand Hall. There was an extremely soft explosion. The amulet scripts in the scroll had exerted their final effect. The flames were generated again. Hundreds of swordsmen of the Qin army swarmed into the Grand Hall, hacking at Shi Yun with their broadswords. This was the last scene the blue bird saw before he flew out of the royal palace. A bloody massacre was taking place in the Xianyang Academy. The blue bird landed on the eave of the watchtower, looking in that direction in silence. Countless soldiers of the Qin army encircled the academy so tightly that not even a drop of water could pass through. The hundreds of scholars wearing swords kicked over the desks in front of them, blocking the thin and useless door of the Grand Hall in an attempt to block the attacks and then counterattack. The arrows fell down from the sky, and the blood stained the windows of the Grand Hall. There were no screams of pain, no screams, and no cries. The Qin army broke through the palace gate and charged in. The scholars pushed open the door of the Grand Hall and approached them. Regardless of how long the sword was, it could be drawn out and killed as long as one wanted to. The intense battle went on for a long time. The scholars killed enemies several times their number, until their swords were broken. They fell to the arrows, to the spears, to the swords, and in the pools of blood, and died. The smell of blood and corpses was everywhere in the Xianyang Academy. Many flies flew over, making buzzing noises, and it was very annoying. The Qin army dug a large pit in the academy and threw the corpses of the scholars into it. Then, they moved the books of the academy and piled them on top of the pit, doused them with tung oil, and set them on fire. The fire was very big, giving off a lot of black smoke. It burned for a long time, and it was not extinguished until evening. The sky was blood red, but was not clear whether it was the twilight or the fire. 900 miles southeast of Xianyang City. It was autumn now, and the mountains were covered with red leaves. Under the light of the setting sun, when the wind blew, it looked like there were countless flames leaping. It was a beautiful scene, like the burning clouds in the sky. Jing Jiu stood on the edge of the cliff, his hair disheveled, his beard reaching his chest, and his clothes in tatters. He looked like a wild man. He looked at the distant Xianyang city and did not speak. In the glow of the setting sun, a temple could be vaguely seen. Chapter 406. Do you know what you're doing? Bai Zhao stared at the Qin emperor as if he were a stranger. The Qin emperor said, "If I don't kill him, who will obey this emperor?" Bai Zhao said, "If you kill him, the people in the world will be even more dissatisfied." The Qin emperor said, "Then I'll keep on killing until nobody dares oppose me." After a moment of silence, Bai Zhao said, "Shi Yun still thinks you won't kill those scholars. You know what I mean." Shi Yun had done an outstanding job in this Tao competition. He would have a higher cultivation state in addition to his comprehension of the Tao competition, and he would become the candidate for the position of the sect master of Yamatai. The Zhongzhou school and Yamatai were allies, and this alliance was the cornerstone of the stability of Chaotian. If Shi Yun changed his mind, Yamatai would be closer to the Aoyama sect. What should he do then? The Qin emperor didn't seem to care about it, as he said, "I told you that I want to forget some things, and I've already forgotten many of them." After a moment of silence, Bai Zhao said, "You can stop now. I remember that you are the beloved daughter of the sect master, but I also remember that the immortals said clearly that the fairy book must stay in the Cloud Dream Mountain, and it's up to one's own ability to decide who it belongs to." The Qin emperor continued calmly while looking at her. "If you don't agree with what I'm doing, you can do whatever you want. I won't stop you." After a moment of silence, Bai Zhao said, "Too many things have happened today. I'll talk to you tomorrow when you calm down." For the sake of the fairy book of longevity, Bai Qianjun was willing to forget those things that were important to him. As such, it was meaningless to talk to him. Bai Zhao was well aware of this. As such, a shocking incident took place in the royal palace of Xianyang that very night. The empress, who had been a coward all her life, led a dozen servant girls in an attempt to assassinate the Qin emperor. After a few precious sticks of heaven and earth dispersed incense were burned to ashes, the empress and those servant girls rushed toward the sleeping Qin emperor on the bed. Some palace servant girls wanted to avenge their companions who had been tortured to death by the Qin emperor. Some palace servant girls did it out of despair, but nobody knew why the empress did it. They tied the Qin emperor up with the sturdiest rope, and then thrust the dagger dipped in poison into his chest. Unexpectedly, the Qin emperor still wore the soft armor on his body even when he was sleeping. Their daggers didn't kill him, but woke him up from his sleep. He stared coldly at the empress and the palace maids. He used Zhen Yuan to force out the poison, broke the dragon rope, and killed the closest palace made with one palm. This assassination attempt ended hastily, but it was the moment when the Qin emperor was closest to death. Even Zhuo Ruzhui and Shi Yun couldn't achieve such a feat. The furious Qin emperor started a bloody purge and revenge. Within Xianyang City, the cavalrymen were killing each other. The Xianyang Academy, which had just been put out, was once again set ablaze. This time, it was reduced to ruins. After all the turmoil had died down, the Qin emperor calmed down. He led the cavalrymen and barged into the Shu Palace, intending to inquire about the source of all this. The Shu Palace was empty. The autumn lotuses in the pond were swaying in the wind, as if they were making fun of him. After a long moment of silence, the Qin emperor said, "Find the princess, but don't touch her. This emperor will kill her myself." Sangzhou was a fortress in the north of the Chu kingdom, governed by the Jing of Silla. Back when the Chu emperor killed the crown prince Jing, the Jing of Silla surrendered to the Qin kingdom out of anger. As a result, Sangzhou became the Sangzhou County of the Qin kingdom. The Jing of Silla was appointed as the South King by the Qin emperor, and he lived in the former capital of the Chu kingdom. But in order to ensure the safety of himself and his subordinates, he left a large number of troops in Sangzhou. A great deal of provisions and armaments were secretly stored in Sangzhou, as well as many hidden wells. Once the troops were mobilized, they would be able to resist for a few years, even if the Qin army besieged the city. In the study room of the former Jing of Silla, Bai Zhao held a pen in his right hand, writing something on a piece of paper according to the information, planning what to do next. Everything in Sangzhou, including the troops, provisions, tunnels, and even the military officers and counselors, was left to him by Tong Yan. He had been wary of that person since many years ago. The current Qin emperor was the young martial god Bai Zhou in Beihai County at the time. The footsteps suddenly broke out in the manor. The door of the study room was pushed open, and the Qin emperor walked in. He, who had never left Xianyang City, came to Sangzhou, which was 1,000 miles away. Jing of Silla, who was supposed to be in the southern part of the city, showed up behind the Qin emperor. Many highly achieved swordsmen of the Qin army came with the Qin emperor and Jing of Silla, and the former subordinates of Tong Yan. Bai Zhao put down the pen and looked at those subordinates. Those subordinates lowered their heads, not daring to look directly at her eyes. The Qin emperor paced around the study room with his hands folded behind his back, looking at the books on the bookshelves with great interest. Did the son of King Qin write letters to this emperor here? He asked Jing of Silla. Jing of Silla replied, "Yes, your majesty." The Qin emperor nodded, and then looked at Bai Zhao behind the desk, his countenance growing cold. Jing of Silla and the others retreated from the room. The Qin emperor stared at Bai Zhao and said, "Back then, he was the one who had laid the foundation for us, but you want to destroy all of it here?" Bai Zhao looked at him in silence and said, "All of this was his to begin with. He thought that he had arranged everything for you before his death, but he didn't realize that death is like the extinguishing of a lamp. He can't even illuminate his own grave, let alone the dark hearts of others. Take the Grand Secretary Zhang of the Chu Kingdom as an example. No matter how well he arranged everything before his death, it was useless. The Qin emperor looked at her and said earnestly, "You are a woman. How could those people left behind by Tong Yin believe you?" Bai Zhao said to him with a seeming smile, "It looks like you have forgotten many things. Otherwise, you wouldn't have said such a thing." The bluebird was on the tree branch outside the window. There was a snowy mountain on the top of the Cloud Dream Peak. The most formidable person in the Zhongzhou school was Bai Jinren. Bai Jinren was a woman. The expression on the Qin emperor's face changed slightly, and he said, "Tong Yin and you have prepared for such a long time, but they have failed so easily. Don't you think it's too meaningless?" "You and Shi Yun have mentioned the word meaningless." Bai Zhao continued, "People often mention something because they are afraid of something. Are you afraid that you will get nothing in the end after all your efforts?" The Qin emperor said icily, "This emperor doesn't want to argue with you. The ownership of the fairy book will prove who is right." Bai Zhao said, "It's hard for you to succeed. It's because there are others here." The Qin emperor said, "Eunuch, you said it yourself that he can't do anything by himself. I'm talking about Jingjiao. You might forget many things in the future, like this name, but I hope you can remember what I said today. He is always here." These were the last words Bai Zhao said in the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror. Then she took out an old book with a yellowish color and opened it, without taking another look at the Qin emperor. The words in the book were a bit strange. They were the variant words she had created herself. Though she couldn't understand these words, she could guess that the first line on the first page should be, "I am Tong Yin." It was tiring to read a book, and it was even more tiring to read those words and symbols that she couldn't understand. She closed her eyes and rested for a while. As she opened her eyes again, she found that she was no longer in that study room, or even in that world. The sunlight shone down from the top of the cave and shone on the moving green sky mirror. It was the same as when she left. It had been decades since she closed her eyes and opened her eyes. For mortals, it was a lifetime. Recalling the years in the illusionary realm, she fell silent for a long time. Her life in the green sky mirror, from Xianyang to Beihai County and then to Xianyang, was actually arranged by herself. It seemed that it was not a problem even now. If she wanted to become the empress, she would face a great deal of resistance. As a result, the story of her fleeing and the uprising of Beihai County had occurred. According to the original plan, by Qianjun, who had become the Qin emperor, would attract all the attention and hatred. Then, she would come out as the princess of the previous dynasty and call for help at a certain moment. However, Shi and Tong Yin didn't expect that Eunuch had met an excellent emperor in the state of Zhao, and the Grand Secretary Zhang had forcibly prolonged the life of the Chu kingdom for another 20 years, which made the situation even more complicated. As such, she didn't complain about the choice made by Qianjun. She suddenly sensed a gaze on her. She turned around and found it was Shi Yun looking at her with a mild smile on his face. He had come out from the illusionary realm only a moment earlier than Bai Zhao. He was indeed a scholar of Yamatai. Even though he had just experienced such a tragedy in the illusionary realm, he had already calmed down completely. Bai Zhao admired him very much. Thinking of what had happened in the royal palace of Xianyang, he said apologetically, "I'm sorry for offending you." Shi Yin didn't mind it. He asked a question with a faint smile. What he was most concerned about was not how the Qin emperor would deal with those disciples after his death, because he had already guessed the outcome. What he wanted to know was another matter. The Chu emperor should be Jingjiao, but he hasn't come out yet. Where is he hiding then? Bai Zhao followed his line of sight and looked in that direction. At the moment, only 3 people were still sleeping by the green sky mirror. Bai Qianjun sat in the front. His eyebrows twitched once in a while, indicating that he was in great pain. Dijon seemed to be asleep, his bald head nodding incessantly. It seemed that he was very sleepy, but it also seemed that he was agreeing with something. Jingjiao was still the same. His eyes were closed, his eyelashes unblinking. His countenance was calm, like a ferryman in the painting. The glass bell hovering in the air behind him gave off a faint ringing every once in a while. Bai Zhao didn't know where Dijon was, nor did he know where Jingjiu was. She shook her head as Shi Yun got up and headed for the outside of the cave. As she came to the Huin Valley, Tong Yin had been waiting for her. It had only been a few days since they parted, but it had been many years for her. She bowed to Jingjiu earnestly. Tong Yin was taken aback a bit, but she understood what she meant. Tong Yin didn't avoid her. "Do you know where Jingjiu went afterward?" she asked Tong Yin after she got up. Bai Zhao widened her eyes in surprise, thinking that it was the world of the green sky mirror, and the blue bird was the mirror spirit, so she knew where Jingjiu was. Why did Jingjiu ask her about it? Seeing her expression, Tong Yin knew what was on her mind. "Jingjiu is missing," she said gravely. Chapter 407. Many people thought that Jingjiu had died in the fire in the royal palace of the Chu kingdom, but Bai Zhao didn't think so. Yet, she didn't know where Jingjiu had gone either, like everybody else in the illusionary realm of the green sky mirror. Yet, she thought that the people in the real world would know where Jingjiu was through the bluebird. Unexpectedly, even the bluebird had lost track of Jingjiu. Seeing the expression on Tong Yan's face, she knew what he was worried about, feeling uneasy as well. What she was worried about was not Jingjiu, but Bai Qianjun. Though their cultivation methods were different, they were nonetheless of the same sect. In the end, in the study room of the manor house of the Jing of Silla in Sangzhou, Bai Qianjun asked everybody else to leave. He left all of his remaining pride to Zhao Liu. He didn't want her to look down on him, so he gave her a chance to fight against him. Bai Zhao chose to give up because he didn't want both of them to be wounded, which would affect the ownership of the fairy book. She was a disciple of the Zhongzhou school, so she would try her best to keep the fairy book on the Cloud Dream Mountain, even though she knew that her opponent was Jingjiu. Tong Yin and Bai Qianjun had the same thought, though Bai Zhenren had never asked them to do so. "I don't understand why the blue bird, as a mirror spirit, doesn't know where Jingjiu is hiding." Tong Yin furrowed her eyebrows slightly. "Where is he, Zhan? Nobody in the illusionary realm knows where he is. Can't the blue bird find him?" Bai Zhao suddenly thought of a possibility. Maybe something had gone wrong with the green sky mirror. "He Zhan is over there," said Tong Yin while pointing to the sky. Bai Zhao followed his finger to look at the sky and saw a patch of blue. What she saw was not the color of the sky. The patch of blue was obviously different from the color of the surrounding sky. It was more serene, giving off a feeling that it was bottomless. It was the scene projected by the heavenly retrieval orb. It was the ocean. On the incomparably vast blue sea, there was a very small black dot. As the blue bird flew towards the sea from a high altitude, the black dot got closer and closer until it could be seen clearly. It turned out to be a person. The man was wearing the clothes of a eunuch and had his hands behind his back as he walked slowly on the calm sea. His face was slightly tanned by the sun and was no longer as pale as before. The gloominess between his brows had been dispersed by the sunlight, and he seemed much more cheerful. He sensed the approach of the bluebird and looked up at the sky. There was no extra emotion in his eyes. The bluebird flew up again, and the image was quickly pulled away. The blue sea still occupied the entire image, and then countless extremely thin white lines gradually appeared. Each white line was a huge ship. There were at least 100 white lines, which meant that there were more than 100 giant ships. That person seemed to be walking slowly on the surface of the sea, but he was actually moving faster than these giant ships. More than 100 giant ships formed a fleet, following him into the depths of the sea. Seeing the scene in the sky, the cultivation practitioners outside the Huin Valley were stunned speechless. Sensei was the only one who was shouting something cheerfully while holding the hand of the young girl Shui Yununnery. That person in the illusionary realm should be in the initial state of the Yuanying state. The cultivation practitioners had seen many such swordsmen, but they had rarely seen such a scene. In such a cultivation state, why did he choose to walk on the surface of the sea instead of riding a sword or flying in the air? Bai Zhao was puzzled as well, asking, "What is he doing?" "He is carefree. Looking at the ocean in the sky, Tong Yin revealed a gratified smile on his face. He knew that his friend had finally been freed from Su Zai's betrayal and Pei Baifa's death. In the words of the Guocheng Temple, his mental barrier had been removed. The smile on his face faded away, and he was even more puzzled. Since the blue bird could find Yijan, there was no reason that it couldn't find Jing Jiao. What was going on? Tong Yin shot a glance at Bai Zhao. Bai Zhao didn't say anything. Back in the illusionary realm, Tong Yin had already guessed what Jing Jiao was going to do, and so had she. But judging from the course of history, Jing Jiao's attempt had no chance of success. More than 10 days later, the sky above the Cloud Dream Mountain was still clear, but a deeper blue appeared in the clear blue sky. It was the ocean in the illusionary realm. The seemingly monotonous ocean was actually quite complicated. If one observed it carefully, he would find that the ocean was divided into many layers, with different shades, colors, and textures. When the wind blew, the ocean would become naughty and violent. But when it was quiet, it would look like a transparent mirror, making people shudder. Moreover, there were all kinds of strange fishes and birds in the ocean, as well as the sea monsters that ate the fishes and birds. There were also many islands and even other continents. Yijan's fleet arrived at the 2 alien continents, so he didn't go deep for exploration for the time being. And it had been 20 years since he left the state of Zhao. One evening, he was a bit bored, so he dove into the bottom of the sea and caught a huge sea turtle. He gave some turtle meat to each ship. The turtle meat was coarse and hard to chew no matter how it was cooked, but it had a special flavor if it was roasted, like raw beef that had been air-dried for a few days. Yijan was lying on the bamboo chair, drinking wine and chewing the turtle meat. He was enjoying the sea breeze with his eyes closed, feeling very happy. A firework suddenly lit up on the surface of the sea in the distance. He squinted slightly. The sea merchants brought the latest news to him. The Empress Dowager, Zhao, had died of illness. In fact, it had happened 70 days ago. Yijan was silent for a while, and then he spat out the turtle meat in his mouth onto the deck, saying, "It's disgusting." Then he carried the wine pot to the back of the deck, where it was covered by the shadow of the cabin. Yijan stood in the shadow for a whole night. It was unclear whether he had drunk the wine pot himself or spilled it into the sea. The next day, the officials of the Intelligence Bureau and the rulers of the various regions of the sea arrived at this patch of the ocean. They had only one question. "Master, are we going back?" Yijan said calmly while looking at the other side of the ocean. "Almost all the people we know are dead. Why should we go back?" Nothing unexpected happened. The Zhao state was conquered by the Qin kingdom less than 3 years after the death of the Dowager Zhao, and the emperor of Zhao was conferred the title of king of Hejian. Many people guessed that the Qin emperor did it on purpose, because he wanted to provoke the elder, he who had disappeared a long time ago, and draw him out. Like what people said about the Chu emperor, people started to miss the elder he after the conquest of the state of Zhao, but it was too late. Soon after, the Qin kingdom conquered the Qi kingdom in 1 year, and it took them another 4 years to exterminate all the barbarian tribes that had fled to the barren north. The world was unified, and the Qin emperor became the final winner. His line of sight was fixed on a mountain 100 miles away in the southeast. Though the Qin emperor had forgotten many things, he didn't forget the first sentence he heard in this world. Regardless of the method, if you can unify the land and become the ruler of the world, you will be recognized by the godly commissioner and obtain the bronze tripod and the fairy book of longevity. That mountain was called Buzhou Mountain. There was a temple on the mountain. It was said that the godly commissioner lived in that temple, but nobody had ever seen it. It was because nobody could get close to that temple. Over the years, the Qin emperor had sent many people to Buzhou Mountain in secret, but none of them had come back. This further strengthened his confidence. He decided to worship the Buzhou Mountain. There were many mountains between Xianyang and Buzhou Mountain, where the roads were difficult to travel and the dense forests were difficult to defend. Since the day the Qin emperor decided to worship the Buzhou Mountain, the Qin kingdom had recruited millions of laborers to break down the mountains, destroy the forests, and transport the rocks to build a broad road. The road was named the Heavenly Road. It was 3 miles wide, with the mud as the foundation and the crushed stones as the surface. The land within 10 miles on both sides of the road had been cleared. It was an unimaginably large project. In order to build this road, the Qin kingdom had levied taxes and treated the populace like slaves. The brutal rule had caused many uprisings, but they were all suppressed by the armored cavalry of the Qin kingdom in the end. Hundreds of thousands of laborers and the same number of rebels were buried in the mud on both sides of the road. In the autumn of the second year, the heavenly road was finished. The Qin emperor didn't wait one more day before announcing the commencement of the grand ceremony of ascension. Tens of thousands of armored cavalrymen and even more soldiers and attendants surrounded and protected the huge black sedan, which left Xianyang City slowly and got on the heavenly road. It took only 9 days for such a large contingent to arrive at the foot of Buzhou Mountain. It was evident how anxious the Qin emperor was. It was the late autumn. The red leaves on Buzhou Mountain looked like the burning clouds, looking very beautiful. The Qin emperor took a bath and changed his clothes, and then he walked up the stone steps after burning the incense sticks and praying. He was very old, with a head full of white hair. The expression in his eyes was as cold as before, and the domineering aura exuding from his black robe was almost tangible. Hundreds of thousands of people knelt down behind him like the tide. Before Bai Zhao left, he had reminded him that he might forget many things, like a certain name. The Qin emperor had indeed forgotten the name, but he felt that someone would appear. It was a bad feeling. As such, he restrained his temper and waited for almost 2 years to finish building this heavenly road. He intended to kill all those who opposed him first and clear all the mountains and fields on both sides of the heavenly road to make sure that nobody would disturb the grand ceremony of ascension. Since no assassins appeared on the heavenly road, he didn't have to worry anymore. There were tens of thousands of armored cavalrymen and countless highly achieved swordsmen here. Even 10 Qin emperors like Duke Missouri couldn't break through the encirclement and come up to the top of the mountain. The Qin emperor was getting closer and closer to the top of the mountain, and a small temple could be vaguely seen. Dozens of swordsmen in black followed behind him, watching the surroundings vigilantly. These swordsmen had been selected carefully and were extremely loyal to the Qin emperor, and they were also powerful and brave. The Qin emperor was still wary of that temple and the legend of the godly commissioner, just like he was wary of anyone or anything that he couldn't control. The fact that those men of sacrifice hadn't returned made him feel uneasy. Nothing unexpected had happened. A small temple appeared at the end of the road. The Qin emperor's breathing grew hasty. It was unclear when the bluebird flew over from afar and landed on a tree branch, looking at the scene in silence. The cultivation practitioners outside the Huin Valley were also looking at the scene. The Qin emperor would obtain the final victory, and the fairy book would remain on the Cloud Dream Mountain. This was what many people had thought of before the Tao competition began. Yet, they couldn't understand why Hejan would suddenly give up the favorable situation of Zhao Zhao and go out to sea on the boat, ignoring the affairs of the world. More importantly, where was Jing Jiao hiding? Was he going to watch the Qin emperor obtain the tripod without doing anything? Sensei was quite anxious, wondering if that beautiful idiot had made a mistake in the rules. The winner of the illusionary realm was not the one who survived to the end. If the Qin emperor obtained the approval of the godly commissioner and succeeded in obtaining the tripod, the Tao competition would end immediately, and all the participants would be sent out. Everybody was looking at the sky, including Tong Yin and Bai Zhao, and so was Bai Zhenren. Standing on the peak top, she looked at the scene in the sky in silence. For some reason, she didn't show any hint of happiness on her face. The Qin emperor turned around and looked at the path he had come from. Looking at the stone steps that looked like a jade belt and the populace at the foot of the mountain like the black tide and the beautiful rivers and mountains, he felt sentimental. He had experienced many hardships along the way. He had given up many things and forgotten many things. Now he had finally come to this place, and nobody could stop him anymore. But he would soon give up all these things. He turned around and walked to the front of the temple and saw the bronze tripod. He was a bit surprised. The bronze tripod was much smaller than he had imagined, and it looked like he could hold it with one hand. A person stood by the bronze tripod, his back facing the outside of the temple. That person wore a white robe, his black hair hanging down to the ground like a waterfall, exuding a fairy aura. He must be the godly commissioner. The Qin emperor untied the crown and put on the ground. He pulled up the front of his robe and stepped over the doorsill. He knelt down on the ground and said humbly, "The Emperor Zhou greets the master, godly commissioner." The person in white turned around. His black hair parted with the wind, exposing his face. That face was desolate and exceedingly beautiful, not something that could be found in the mortal world. He was indeed a ferryman. The Qin emperor lifted his head and was about to praise the godly commissioner, but he suddenly felt the face looked familiar, and he was taken aback. "You are not the godly commissioner?" The Qin emperor suddenly remembered many things and yelled in extreme shock, "No, you are Jingjiu." Jingjiu looked at him in silence, saying nothing. The Qin emperor felt it was ridiculous, yelling with a pale face, "It's impossible. How could you be here? You were on the other side of the mountain range. You abandoned the box and the horse, cut off the rope, and carried the insults and curses on your back. You had finally reached the peak top, but you suddenly found that this was merely a small hill in the vast heaven and earth. Most importantly, your opponent had been waiting here for a long time. This was indeed the most ridiculous thing, and also the most painful thing. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.